She was 8 months pregnant when the woman wearing her necklace kissed her husband. Not in secret, not in the dark. In the same restaurant booth where he got down on one knee 6 years ago and promised her forever. Serena Vale leaned across the white tablecloth, pressed her lips to Dante Moretti's mouth, and let the diamond pendant, the one he said he was saving for the birth of their daughter, catch the candlelight like it belonged to her. And the worst part? It almost did. Because while Elara Moretti stood outside in the rain, with one hand pressed to her swollen stomach, she realized the affair was the small betrayal. What Serena had on her phone, what Elara glimpsed in that single unguarded second, that was the thing that would burn everything down. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who swore they loved you, stay with me. Because this story is about to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. I release new stories every week. And trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Elara's life changed forever started the way most catastrophic mornings do, quietly and without warning. She woke at 6:15 to the sound of rain against the bedroom windows and reached across the mattress without thinking. Her hand found cold sheets. Dante's side of the bed had been empty long enough that the warmth was completely gone. And for a moment, Elara just lay there with her palm flat against that cold space, feeling the particular loneliness of a woman who had learned not to ask too many questions. She was 34 years old, 8 months pregnant, with a daughter they had already named Mira, and married to a man whose name made grown men look at the floor when they heard it. Dante Moretti. The name meant something specific in New York. It meant stay out of his shipping lanes. It meant don't let your business compete with his clubs on Cis East Side. It meant when his private security firm showed up at your door, you paid what you owed and you thanked him for the reminder. It meant power the old-fashioned, inherited, permanently blood-stained kind. What it did not mean, at least not in the early years, was cruelty. Not to Elara. She found his note on the kitchen counter beneath a glass of prenatal vitamins he'd set out for her before he left. That detail always got her later, the fact that he'd remembered the vitamins. The small, careful domesticity of it sitting right next to the lie. Emergency meeting, don't wait up. Home before midnight. Do you know I love you? He'd stopped writing that about 8 months ago, around the same time Serena Vale joined his organization as his personal assistant, and the distance between them started feeling less like stress and more like intention. Elara took the vitamins. She drank the orange juice that was also waiting for her. She stood in the kitchen of the mansion she had spent 3 years helping to transform from a symbol of criminal money into something that could pass for a legitimate family home. And she told herself what she had been telling herself for months. He's under pressure. The business is complicated. He loves you. He's just distracted. She was good at that, at finding the reasonable explanation, at being, as her mother once said with a mixture of admiration and worry, too understanding for your own good, baby girl. Her prenatal appointment was at 11. Her driver, Marco, took her in the black SUV that Dante insisted on because he didn't trust New York traffic around a pregnant woman, and Elara sat in the back with her folder of financial documents she'd been quietly organizing for the past several weeks. Not because she suspected anything specific. She just liked to understand things. She always had. It was why Dante had first trusted her with the books, because Elara had a gift for seeing patterns in numbers that other people missed, and because she was the only person in his orbit who wasn't afraid to tell him when something didn't add up. The appointment went fine. The baby was fine. Elara pressed the headphones to her stomach on the way home and let Mira listen to something soft, and she made small talk with Marco about whether the rain would clear by the weekend, and she was almost calm. She was almost settled into the kind of ordinary Tuesday that she could handle. Then Marco slowed without explanation. Traffic. A fender bender 2 blocks up had snarled everything on Cavallo Street, and they sat in it for nearly 10 minutes before Marco took a side turn that looped them past the restaurant district near the pier. Elara was not looking for him. That matters. She needs you to understand that she was not the kind of wife who tracked her husband's location or drove past restaurants hoping to catch him in something. She was looking at her phone, actually reviewing a note she'd made about a wire transfer that seemed irregular when she glanced up and saw the gold awning. Bellavere. Even now, years later, she could describe the font on that awning in her sleep. Dark gold letters on cream canvas, the little flourish on the B. She'd stared at it the night Dante proposed, her hands shaking so hard that she'd nearly spilled the champagne he'd ordered. She noticed the awning. She registered it, the way you register familiar things, with a kind of automatic, pleasant recognition. And then her eyes moved, the way eyes do, through the large rain-streaked window to the left of the entrance. And she stopped breathing. She didn't say anything. She didn't make a sound. She just stopped. Every system in her body went into a strange, suspended stillness, the way it does when your brain receives information that it refuses, initially, to process. Dante was at the corner booth, their booth the one he'd specifically requested, on the night he proposed, because it had the best view of the harbor, and he'd wanted her to see the lights. He was leaning slightly forward, his dark jacket on the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled up the way he only did when he was relaxed and comfortable and feeling safe. Across from him sat Serena Vale, dark hair, the kind of effortless beauty that costs a great deal of effort to maintain. The kind of woman who wore an expression of studied softness around powerful men, because she understood exactly what it communicated. Dante's hand was resting over hers on the table, not reaching for it, not accidentally touching, covering it, deliberately. The way you cover someone's hand when you want them to feel held. Elara watched Serena lean forward. She watched Serena close the distance across the table. She watched her husband not pull back. The world outside the car window continued to exist: rain, traffic, someone honking 2 cars back, and inside the SUV, everything was perfectly, brutally silent, except for the sound of Elara's own breathing, which had gone very shallow and very careful. Then she saw the necklace. It was around Serena's throat. A diamond pendant on a white gold chain. Simple design. Elegant. The kind of thing that looked understated until you were close enough to see the quality of the stones. Elara knew that necklace. She knew it because she'd been with Dante when he'd seen it in the jeweler's case at Harrow & Cole, the private boutique on Mercer Street, where he bought her things on anniversaries. She knew it because he'd picked it up, turned it in the light, and said, "This one," and when the jeweler had started packaging it, Dante had stopped her and asked for it to be held. "I'm saving it," he'd told Elara when she asked, "for after Mira comes. For when you need something beautiful." That had been 4 months ago. Elara put her hand on the door handle. Marco turned in the front seat. "Mrs. Moretti, pull over." His voice was careful. "Ma'am, Marco." She said his name once, quietly, and something in her tone stopped every argument he had. "Pull over the car." He did. She got out into the rain without a coat. She was wearing a cream-colored maternity dress and flat boots, and she walked the half-block to the restaurant entrance with one hand at her side and one hand, instinctively, resting against her stomach. Not for balance, for something else. Something that had nothing to do with being careful and everything to do with making a silent promise to the persons inside her. "Whatever happens next, you are the reason I stay standing." The hostess at the Bellavere entrance saw Elara coming, and her expression went through 3 different things in less than 2 seconds. Recognition, because Elara had dined here regularly for 6 years, and the staff knew her face. Discomfort, because a woman at table 7 was wearing jewelry that belonged to the woman now walking through the door. And something close to pity, which Elara noticed and quietly hated. She didn't stop at the host stand. Restaurant was perhaps half full. A Tuesday lunch crowd, business people, a couple near the window, 2 women celebrating something with Prosecco. The normal machinery of other people's ordinary days. Conversation floated and clinked, silverware against plate, low music from somewhere unseen. It all stopped, not loudly, not all at once, but one table caught sight of her and fell quiet, and that quiet rippled outward the way quiet does in a room when something is about to happen that everyone can feel. Elara Moretti, 8 months pregnant, walked through the dining room of the restaurant where her husband had proposed to her, toward the corner booth where he was sitting with his mistress. Dante saw her when she was 6 tables away. She watched him see her, watched the blood leave his face, watched him straighten in the booth, watched his hand leave Serena's, watched Serena turn to look, and then go very still in a way that was not surprise. It was calculation. Even in that moment, Serena was calculating. Dante stood up. Elara. She stopped at the edge of the table. She looked at Serena first. Just a look. Nothing theatrical. She studied the necklace at Serena's throat the way you study something that was taken from you, not with rage yet, with a kind of cold, terrible recognition. Then she looked at her husband, the man who had made her prenatal vitamin regimen a priority that same morning. The man who had told her the necklace was for after the birth. The man who had told her he was in his emergency business meeting while he sat in their engagement restaurant with his hands over another woman's hands. "You left your pregnant wife alone at home," Elara said, "to take your mistress to the place where you asked me to marry you." Her voice was level. She had always had a terrifying capacity for calm at the moments when other people expected screaming. It was the calm that got to people. It was the calm that landed like a weight. Dante's mouth opened. Nothing came out. And in the 20-some years he had spent building an empire on the strength of never showing weakness, in all the negotiations and confrontations and moments where lesser men had crumbled under his silence, this was the first time she had ever seen him have absolutely nothing to say. She reached down, removed her wedding ring. It was not a dramatic gesture. She didn't slam it or throw it. She simply set it beside his wineglass with the precise, deliberate care of someone returning something that no longer belonged to them. Then she turned to leave. She had taken 2 steps when she became aware of why she had originally frozen on the sidewalk outside. Not just the kiss, not just the necklace. Before the kiss, before Elara had even fully processed what she was seeing, Serena's phone had been face up on the table, and the screen had lit with a notification. Just for a second, just long enough. A name, a message preview, a number that Elara recognized from Dante's own files, from the accounting work she'd done quietly for his transition into legitimate business. Victor Calder. The name hit her in the stomach like something physical. Victor Calder was not a man you texted. Victor Calder was the single person in New York whose ambitions and reach came closest to Dante's own. The man Dante had described once, in a very rare moment of honesty, as the only person who would genuinely enjoy watching him fail. Serena Vale was texting Victor Calder on her personal phone during a lunch that Dante believed was private. Elara walked out of Bellavere into the rain. Marco was waiting at the curb, his face carefully neutral, his eyes full of something he would never say out loud. She got into the car. She sat very still. She did not cry. She felt the baby move, a small interior shift, a flutter of something alive and separate and entirely dependent on her, and she pressed her hand against her side and thought clearly, with a precision that surprised even her, about what she had just seen. Her husband was having an affair. That was the wound she would carry for years. But Serena Vale was running something that had nothing to do with love. And Dante had no idea. "Marco," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Don't take me home." A pause. "Where would you like to go?" She looked out at the rain, at the restaurant window behind them, where she could still see the pale shape of Dante watching her leave. "Somewhere quiet," she said. "I need to think." She checked into the Alderton Hotel under her maiden name, Vaughn, paying with the personal card she'd maintained independently throughout their marriage, because her mother had raised her to always have a door she could walk through alone if she had to. The room was clean and bland and perfectly anonymous, which was exactly what she needed. She ordered room service, something bland and warm, because she hadn't eaten since the vitamins and Mira needed fuel regardless of what her mother's heart was doing, and she spread her documents across the bed. She was not looking for evidence of the affair. She had already found that. She was looking for Victor Calder. The financial records she'd been quietly organizing were the product of 3 years of careful, methodical work. When Dante had first decided to begin transitioning his inherited criminal empire into legitimate business real estate, private security, hospitality, a small shipping subsidiary. He'd asked Elara to help build the structure because she understood money in the way he understood people. She had a degree in finance that she'd never quite found a way to use until he'd handed her a problem nobody else could solve without getting themselves into trouble. She had done the work because she was good at it, because it mattered, because she genuinely believed that building something legal and lasting for their family was more important than the world his father had built. She had kept copies of everything, not out of suspicion. That's what she needed people to understand later, when this all became something that required explanation. She kept copies because she was careful, because she liked having records of her own work, because the version of Elara Vaughn, who grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, watching her mother balance the household budget with the obsessive precision of someone who could not afford to make a single mistake, had never learned how to do things without a backup. The backup was now spread across a hotel bed. She started with the subsidiary accounts she'd flagged 2 weeks earlier. The numbers that hadn't sat right. The transfers that were technically legal, but structurally strange, too many intermediary steps. Too much movement between accounts that should have been dormant. It took her 4 hours to find the thread. By the time she found it, the room service had gone cold. The rain had softened to a drizzle outside her window, and her back ached in the specific way that an 8-month pregnancy creates a grinding, persistent discomfort that no position fully resolved. She sat cross-legged on the hotel bed, with pillows stacked behind her and her reading glasses on, and she followed the money through 3 different shell entities until it became undeniable. Someone had been systematically moving funds from Dante's legitimate operations for at least 7 months. Small amounts at first, the kind of amounts that get lost in the noise of large-scale business activity, but regular, structured, intentional, always moving toward the same cluster of accounts that, when she traced their registration details, pointed back, through layers of misdirection, to a name she'd never seen before in Dante's records. The name led her, after another hour of careful searching through the documents she had access to a real estate LLC incorporated in Delaware 18 months earlier. The registered agent was a woman named S. Vale. Elara sat with that for a long time. She took off her reading glasses. She set them on the nightstand. She lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling of the Alderton hotel room and felt, moving through her, at approximately the pace of cold water, the full shape of what she was looking at. The affair was not the point. Serena Vale had not fallen in love with Dante Moretti. She had identified him. She had mapped his organization, found the access point, and positioned herself inside it. The personal relationship, whatever it was, however real it felt to Dante, was the scaffolding. The real structure was financial. 7 months of quiet extraction, building toward something larger, and every day that Dante spent believing Serena loved him was another day he didn't look at his own accounts. But the Victor Calder connection, that was, the piece Elara couldn't yet fully see. She picked up her phone. She had 17 missed calls from Dante. 2 from his lieutenant, a man named Gale, who had been with the organization since before Dante inherited it. 1 from her mother, who had likely heard something through the informal network of people who knew everyone in the circles Elara moved in. She set the phone face down. She needed to think before she talked. She needed to be absolutely certain before she brought this to Dante, because the moment she did, one of 2 things would happen. Either he would believe her, which meant he would know that the woman he'd chosen over his pregnant wife was systematically destroying everything they built together, or he wouldn't believe her. She fell asleep, somewhere around 11, with the documents still spread around her, and her hand resting on her stomach, and the particular exhausted heaviness of a woman who has been carrying too much for too long, finally allowing her body to stop. In the morning she would try. In the morning she would call him. She spent 20 minutes the next day on the phone with Dante before she understood that it was already too late. Not too late in the sense that she was out of time. Too late in the sense that someone had gotten there first. Dante's voice on the phone had a quality she recognized immediately, not anger, not guilt, but something tighter and stranger than both. A defensive coldness that she had heard him use in negotiations when he felt cornered. When he felt that an argument was coming for him that he wasn't ready to counter, and his instinct was to build a wall before the other person could get close enough to make it. I don't want to do this on the phone, he said. Dante, I need you to listen to me. This is not about last night. It's always about last night with you right now. That stopped her. With you right now. As though she had been difficult. As though she was the problem in a pattern he'd been tolerating. What has she told you? Elara asked, carefully, directly. Silence. Then, come home and we'll talk. What has Serena told you about me, Dante? The silence that followed was different from the first one. It was the silence of a man deciding how much to confirm, which is a kind of confirmation in itself. She told me you've been planning to leave, he said finally. He stopped, started again. She said you have documents, that you were going to use them. Elara closed her eyes. She's already framed it. Serena had told Dante that Elara was gathering documents to use against him, which meant every record Elara had preserved the honest, careful work of 3 years, her backup copies, her financial analysis would look, from Dante's side of the phone call, exactly like what Serena had described. A wife building a case against her husband. A woman preparing to walk away and take the evidence with her. She had been outmaneuvered before she even knew the game had started. Those documents are to protect us, Elara said. Someone has been taking money from your accounts for 7 months. I have the records. I need you to come home, Elara. Dante, listen to me. Serena Vale has a shell company. Come home. We'll talk. She has been moving money to Victor Calder's. I said, come home. The authority in his voice landed like a door slamming. She knew that voice. She had been in the room when he used it on men who owed him answers, and she had always been the one person it had never been directed at. Until now. Elara stood very straight in the hotel room. Outside the window, New York was doing what it did every morning and different, continuing, enormous. I'll come home, she said quietly, but not because you told me to. What happened when she arrived at the mansion 3 hours later was the kind of thing that the careful, controlled version of Elara Vaughn had always privately feared, not because she hadn't seen Dante exercise power before, but because she had never been on the receiving end of it, and there was a particular horror in discovering that the machinery you had watched operate on strangers operated the same way on you. The account freeze she discovered first, her personal card declined at a pharmacy when she stopped to pick up something for the headache that had been building since the morning. She stood at the register and felt the specific public humiliation of a card that didn't work while the person behind her waited. She paid in cash. She had cash, the old habit of the woman her mother raised, who did not trust the world to always cooperate with her needs. Then she arrived at the mansion gate and it didn't open. She sat in the car and pressed the intercom 3 times. The guard who answered was not one she recognized, which told her something immediately. Dante had rotated the security. The people who knew her, who had opened this gate for her for 3 years, were somewhere else today. Mrs. Moretti, the voice on the intercom said, with a formality that was its own kind of knife, Mr. Moretti has asked that you schedule a time to collect your personal. I live here, she said. Yes, ma'am, I understand. But this is my home. A long pause. Mr. Moretti's instructions are that. She released the intercom button. She didn't need to hear the rest. She looked up at the house she had helped redesign, the house where she had planned its nursery with pale yellow walls and white wooden furniture. The house where her daughter's room was waiting, with the mobile she'd ordered from a small shop in Vermont because it had tiny wooden birds that spun slowly in a circle, and she had thought Mira would like too. Watch them turn, and she saw the upstairs window. Dante was there, standing at the window of his study. Could see her. She could see him. There was a floor and a wall of glass between them and approximately the entire architecture of a marriage that was crumbling in real time. She got out of the car. She stood on the sidewalk outside her own house and looked up at her husband standing at the window, and she felt 1,000 things simultaneously: fury, grief, disbelief, the sharp, persistent ache of someone being erased from her own life. And then she felt something underneath all of it, something colder and strangely quieter. Clarity. You think throwing me out makes me powerless, she said. She was talking to the window. She knew he could see her. She didn't raise her voice because she had never needed to. It only means I have nothing left to protect except my daughter and the truth. She waited. He did not come down. She got back in the car, and she told Marco to drive, and she held her stomach with both hands and breathed through the tightening in her chest that was grief trying to become panic, and that she absolutely refused to let win. Her phone buzzed, an alert from a financial news feed she subscribed to. Moretti Logistics Warehouse Fire, South Brooklyn. Authorities responding. She read the headline twice. Then she pulled up the location on her map. That was Dante's oldest warehouse. The one his father had built before Dante was born. The one that held records and equipment and the particular kind of irreplaceable institutionless memory that a criminal organization accumulates over generations. It was burning, and as she stared at her phone in the back of a car on a street outside a house she could no longer enter, Elara understood, with the sick, precise intuition of someone who has just seen the patterns snap into focus, that whatever Serena Vale was building, it had just moved to the next stage. The war was starting, and somehow she didn't yet know how, but she could feel it coming. Somehow Elara's name was about to be attached to the match. The news alert stayed on Elara's phone screen for a long time after the words stopped meaning anything new. She read it 4 more times, not because she didn't understand it, because understanding it fully required accepting that the situation had moved faster than she had, which was something Elara Vaughn had never been comfortable accepting about anything. The warehouse fire, South Brooklyn. Dante's oldest facility, the one that predated everything he'd built himself, the one that held the bones of his father's operation, the paper trail of 2 generations of a family that had never fully decided whether it wanted to be legitimate or not. Gone. And she was sitting in the back of a car outside a house she couldn't enter, 8 months pregnant, with frozen accounts and a set of financial documents that someone had already successfully reframed as evidence of her own guilt. Marco was watching her in the rearview mirror. He had been with the Moretti household for 9 years, long enough that he had driven Dante's mother to her chemotherapy appointments and carried Elara's grocery bags in the rain without being asked. He was not Elara's employee, he was Dante's. But there was something in the way he was watching her right now, careful, unhappy, the expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening and found it genuinely shameful, that told her he hadn't yet decided which version of this story he believed. "Marco," she said, "do you still have your brother's contact in the fire department?" A pause. "Yes, ma'am. Can you find out if it was an accident?" Another pause longer. "Mrs. Moretti, I know what I'm asking." He looked at her in the mirror for another moment. Then he nodded once, pulled out his personal phone, and dialed. Elara looked back at the house. Dante had left the window. She thought about the documents on the hotel bed. She thought about the shell company registered to S. Vale. She thought about the name Victor Calder appearing on a phone screen in the restaurant where her husband had just publicly humiliated her, and she tried to organize what she knew into a structure that had a logical next step. The problem was that she was working with incomplete information, and the person who had the rest of it was currently inside a house she was locked out of, being managed by a woman who had spent months carefully constructing a version of Elara that Dante was now prepared to believe. Marco lowered his phone. "It wasn't an accident," he said quietly. "Device in the southeast corner of the building. Accelerant. Professional job." Elara absorbed that. "Who knows that?" she asked. "Right now? The investigators, the fire captain. And whoever said it." She nodded. "Take me back to the hotel." He started the car. She watched the mansion disappear behind them, in the side mirror, and felt the particular grief of watching something leave that you can't make stay. Then she pushed the grief down, because grief was a thing she couldn't afford to run on right now, and she opened her phone and called the one person she should have called 12 hours earlier. Her mother answered on the second ring, Eleanor Vaughn. Her mother never called her Elara. Never had. She had given her daughter Doffer a formal name and used the whole of it whenever she wanted to make a point. "Where are you?" It was not a question. "I'm fine," Elara said. "The baby is fine." "I didn't ask about the baby. I asked where you are." A hotel. I'm okay. Mom, I need you to do something for me. I've been calling you since this morning. Rosa Paredo's daughter saw you at Bellavere and called her mother, and her mother called me before 9 o'clock, which means the entire neighborhood knew before you called your own mother. Mom. Elara pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. I need you to go stay with Aunt Cecile for a few days. Silence. Then why? I can't explain everything right now. I just need to know you're not at the apartment alone. Her mother's voice shifted. The indignation dropped out of it, replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous, the particular stillness of a woman who raised a daughter alone in Queens and knew exactly what the various registers of I can't explain right now meant. Elara, what is happening? I found something. In Dante's accounts. It involves someone the situation is more complicated than just the affair, and I need to know you're somewhere safe while I figure out how to handle it. A very long silence. This woman, her mother said. This assistant. Yes. She's not just sleeping with him. No. Another silence. Then her mother said, with the flat, weighted certainty of a woman delivering a verdict, I'll be at Cecile's by tonight. You call me every day. You hear me? Every single day, or I'm calling the police myself. I hear you. And Elara, a pause. You are smarter than every person in that man's orbit. You always have been. Don't let them make you forget that. Elara held the phone against her ear for a moment after the call ended, not quite ready to put it down. Then she set it on the seat beside her and watched the city go past outside the window and let herself feel for approximately 30 seconds the full weight of everything she was carrying. 30 seconds. She had learned that trick from her mother, actually. You give yourself the time. You don't fight it. And then you pick back up. At the hotel, she laid everything out again. The documents. Her laptop. The handwritten notes she'd made the previous night. The ones that traced the money through the shell entities back to the S. Vale LLC. She ordered coffee and sat at the small desk by the window and began building what she thought of, privately, as the case the organized, evidence-based account of what Serena Vale had actually been doing inside Dante's organization for the past 7 months. The picture that assembled itself over the next 3 hours was worse than she'd initially understood. It wasn't just the money. The money was significant. She estimated somewhere between 8 and 12 million moved out of the legitimate operations through the shell accounts, with more likely in transit, but it was the other thing that made her stomach drop. The communication patterns. She didn't have access to Serena's phone. She didn't have access to the direct messages. What she had were the financial transaction logs and the timing records and the operational notes she'd compiled as part of her own legitimate work for the business transition. And when she laid those against the timeline of the past 7 months, a pattern emerged that was deeply, methodically calculated. Every major internal conflict inside Dante's organization during the past 6 months, every accusation of disloyalty, every senior member who had been pushed out or sidelined had been preceded by exactly 2 to 3 weeks by a significant movement of funds through one of Serena's intermediate accounts. She was not just stealing, she was destabilizing. She was manufacturing distrust inside the organization, pushing out the people who were most likely to notice the financial irregularities, and doing it with the kind of patient precision that required either a very sophisticated understanding of organizational dynamics or very good coaching from someone who had already studied how to take apart an operation, like Dante's. Victor Calder, Elara thought. Victor Calder, who had been trying to move against Dante's territories for 3 years, who had the resources and the motive and the intelligence infrastructure, but not the inside access. Until Serena. The affair was the entry point. Everything else was the operation. And Dante brilliant, controlled. Dante, who had navigated the most dangerous landscape in organized New York for 15 years, had walked directly into it because he had an ego that required regular reassurance and a wife who was 8 months pregnant and therefore not his most compelling source of excitement, and Serena Vale had understood both of those things from day one. Elara sat back in her chair. She did not feel triumphant about understanding this. She felt tired and sad and a little sick, and her back hurt, and she wanted, in some private, unreasonable corner of herself, to be able to call her husband and have him listen. Instead, she picked up her phone and called Gail. Gail Reyes had been with the Moretti operations since before Dante took over from his father. He was 61 years old, built like a piece of construction equipment, and possessed of the particular loyalty that develops in men who have made irrevocable choices early in their lives and committed to them fully. He was also, in Elara's experience, one of the approximately 3 people inside Dante's organization who was completely incapable of lying to her face. He wasn't sentimental about it. It was just that Elara had always treated him with basic respect, and Gail responded to respect the way a compass responds to north. He answered immediately, "Mrs. Moretti, is Dante with you?" "No, ma'am." "Where is he?" A short pause. "Meeting with the senior partners." "About the warehouse, Gail." She kept her voice even. "I need you to listen to me for 2 minutes without interrupting." "Can you do that?" Another pause. "Longer." "Yes. Someone inside the organization has been running money through shell accounts for 7 months. The accounts trace back to Serena Vale. She also has communications. I can't prove the content yet, but I have the transaction timing that suggests she's been coordinating with Victor Calder. The warehouse fire was not an accident. I believe it was the next phase of an operation designed to start a war between Dante and Victor while she continues to drain the legitimate businesses." Silence. She waited. "Mrs. Moretti," Gail said finally. His voice was very careful. "Has Mr. Moretti seen this information?" "I tried to tell him this morning. He didn't." She stopped. Chose the honest version. "He doesn't trust my account of things right now." She's gotten to him first. "I need someone inside who can put this in front of him from a position he'll actually hear." Another silence. She could hear Gail breathing, which meant he was doing the things she'd seen him do in rooms when decisions were being made, the slow, methodical processing of a man who did not move until he was ready, but moved with absolute commitment when he did. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need you to make sure he has a forensic accountant look at the Albridge Holdings transactions from the last 6 months before he makes any decisions about the warehouse. And if he won't listen, then tell me, and I'll go to his attorney directly." A very long pause. "He's not going to like that." "I know. He's already people have said things. About why you left. What you might be doing, I know that too." She paused. "Gail, you've known me for 3 years. Have I ever done anything that didn't have his best interest in it?" The pause that followed was the kind that contains an entire opinion. "No, ma'am," he said, "you haven't." "Then I need you to trust that." He said he would do what he could. He hung up. Elara sat for a moment with her hand on the phone, then went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, the shadows under her eyes, the way stress had tightened the muscles around her jaw, the visible evidence of a woman running on determination and prenatal vitamins and not enough sleep, and went back to work. The call from Dante came 2 hours later. She answered it because she had promised herself she would stay available. Because the version of Elara Vaughn that had learned over 3 years of marriage to a powerful and complicated man that refusing to engage was just another way of losing ground. "The evidence from the warehouse?" Dante said without greeting. "They found records." She went still. "What kind of records?" "Financial transfers. Between an account registered to your maiden name and a company connected to Victor Calder's operations." A pause. Each word delivered with a flatness that was worse than anger. Dated from the last 4 months. Elara felt the floor tilt slightly under her. Not literally. Just the internal version, the sensation of something solid becoming unreliable. "That's not possible," she said. "I have the documentation in front of me." "Dante, listen to me. I've been listening to you," he said. And now the flatness cracked slightly, and she could hear it not just anger, but something frightened underneath it, which was the most dangerous thing Dante Moretti could feel, because fear in him did not look like fear. It looked like certainty. "I've been listening to you tell me things since yesterday, and everything you've said has a document that says the opposite." Because she put those documents there. Elara's voice was steady. She was working very hard to keep it steady. "Dante, think. How convenient is it that evidence of my supposed betrayal appears in the same building that burns down the same day I tried to tell you about her accounts. She framed this. She burned the warehouse to plant the evidence and destroy your records at the same time. You're telling me my personal assistant orchestrated an arson and a frame-up? Yes. To what end? To start a war between you and Victor while she runs with somewhere between 8 and 12 million from your legitimate businesses. Silence. She pressed forward. I have the transaction records. The shell company, Gail, is going to ask you to look at the Albridge Holdings transfers. Gail already called me. Another silence. Elara, I don't know what to believe right now. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in 2 days, and somehow it hurt more than the accusations. Because it meant he was genuinely suspended between versions, between the Serena-shaped story that had been carefully installed in his head over 7 months, and the Elara he had actually lived with for 6 years. And the fact that he couldn't resolve the two without effort told her exactly how thoroughly Serena had done her work. Then let me give you the records, Elara said. Let me sit down with your accountant and your attorney and show them what I found. No agenda, just the information. A long pause. I'll set something up, he said. And then, after another pause, how are you? The baby. We're fine. The words came out flatter than she intended. We're managing. He made a sound low, almost inaudible. Like something trying to form itself into words and not quite making it. She hung up before it could become something she had to respond to. The meeting never happened. 20 hours later, Serena moved again. Elara didn't know the specific sequence of events. In the order they occurred, she would piece it together later, the way you piece together the shape of a storm after it's passed through, from the damage it left behind. What she knew in real time was that at 7:40 in the morning, Gail called her, and his voice had a quality she had never heard from him before. You need to know what's happening, he said. She's been talking to the senior partners. Since last night, she's telling them that the documents you have are the same ones you've been building to hand over to the federal investigators who've been looking at the shipping subsidiary. Elara's chest went cold. What federal investigators? The ones who've apparently been building a case for 16 months. A heavy pause. Which is something Mr. Moretti did not know about until this morning. When she told him, she sat down on the hotel bed. Her legs didn't exactly fail, they just decided that this was a moment that required sitting. She told him there were federal investigators, and that you'd been their source. Gail, I know. I am not their source. I have never spoken to federal investigators about anything. I believe you, Mrs. Moretti. Does Dante believe me? The pause that followed told her everything. She stood back up. Because sitting was not an option anymore. Because the situation had just completed its transformation from a personal betrayal into something that threatened Dante's freedom, his business, his people, the entire structure of a life that, whatever its complications, she had spent 3 years helping to toward something sustainable. And if Serena had convinced his organization that Elara was a federal informant, then the people who had been calling for action since the warehouse fire would now have a justification. How much time do I have, she said, before someone decides to do something stupid? Gail didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. She's the one pushing hardest, he said. She's been in the room with the partners for 2 hours. She keeps saying you need to be... He stopped, chose his words. That you're a liability. Elara thought about her mother. At Aunt Cecile's. Safe. She thought about Mira, 8 months along, entirely unaware of what the world she was about to enter looked like. She thought about Dante standing at the window of the house that morning. Ugh. Watching her walk away, and the expression she couldn't quite read through the glass from that distance. Tell him I'm coming in, she said. Tell him I'll bring everything I have. All of it. The transaction records, the shell company registration, everything. Tell him I want 1 hour in a room with him and his attorney before he lets anyone make any decisions. And if he says no, she thought about that. Tell him, she said quietly, that the next call I make is to his attorney directly, and the one after that is to the investigators not to help them build a case, but to make sure they know what Serena Vale has been doing with his money, because if she succeeds in burning his legitimate businesses from the inside while his organization thinks I'm the enemy, he's going to lose everything. He spent 15 years building, and I will not watch that happen to my daughter's father without at least making sure he had a chance to stop it. Silence. Then Gale said, with the grave, reluctant tone of a man reporting something he finds personally painful, "He already told the partners you won't be given access to any of the properties." She felt that land somewhere in the middle of her chest, in the place where the marriage still lived, regardless of what had happened to it. "Then tell him," she said, "that he just made the biggest mistake of his life." She ended the call. She stood in the middle of the hotel room with her documents and her laptop and her phone, and with the particular stillness of a woman who has just run out of the diplomatic option. And she felt the situation complete its final transformation around her. This was no longer about an affair. This was no longer even about money, or Serena, or Victor Calder's ambitions. This was about a man who had chosen the wrong person to trust at the worst possible moment, and who was now so thoroughly encircled by that choice that every attempt Elara made to reach him was being intercepted and repackaged as a threat. She sat down at the desk. She opened her laptop. She began composing an encrypted message to Dante's attorney, a man named Harlan Bryce, who had been the family's legal counsel for 11 years, and who had, in Elara's experience, approximately zero patience for complications that cost his clients money. She attached every document she had: the transaction logs, the shell company registration, the timing analysis that showed the correlations between Serena's account movements and the internal personnel decisions over the past 6 months. All of it organized and labeled with the clear, precise economy of a woman who had learned financial documentation from her mother's kitchen table. Then she opened a separate file she hadn't looked at in 2 days. The notes she'd made in the car outside Bellevere, in the first minutes after the shock settled enough for her to write. The things she'd seen on Serena's phone screen before the kiss, before the necklace registered fully, before the weight of everything descended. Victor Calder's name, and beneath it, visible for only a second before the screen went dark, a single line of text that she had written down from memory in the car while her hands were still shaking. Warehouse Wednesday. Make sure she's visible. She had written it down because her brain had flagged it as important without yet knowing why. She understood now. Wednesday was when the fire had happened, and she, the visible one, was supposed to be Elara. Serena had not just framed her with documents. She had planned, from the beginning, to make sure Elara appeared to be present, or accounted for, in a way that connected her to the warehouse on the day it burned. Elara stared at her notes. Her hands were completely steady. That frightened her a little, actually the steadiness, the absolute cold clarity that had settled over her in the past hour. She recognized it as the emotional place you reach when you've moved past panic and past grief into something that is not calm, exactly, but its functional equivalent. The place where the only thing left is what needs to be done. She finished the message to Harlan Bryce. She attached the note about the Wednesday text. She sent it. Then she picked up her phone and pulled up the contact she had never expected to use. A woman named Petra Andrus, a forensic accountant she had met at a finance conference 4 years ago, before Mira, before the transition project, before any of this. A woman who worked independently, who had a reputation for following money through structures that were specifically designed to be unfollowable, and who Elara had stayed in casual contact with because she had always, quietly, believed that knowledge of someone like Petra was the kind of thing you wanted to have before you needed it. She needed it now. Petra answered on the third ring with a voice like someone who had already been awake for hours and found early mornings offensive on principle. "Vaughn, it's been a while. I have something I need you to look at." A pause. How complicated. 7 months of layered transfers through 4 shell entities designed to look like operational variants. She paused. "And I'm 8 months pregnant and working from a hotel room, so I need someone who can move fast." A longer pause. How fast? "I think I have maybe 48 hours before the people who currently believe I'm a federal informant decide to stop debating what to do about that." Silence. Then Petra said, with the particular dry practicality of a woman who had spent her career in rooms where a lot of money had gone wrong, "Send me everything you have." Already drafting the email, and Elara. A pause. Are you safe right now? Elara thought about that question. She thought about what safe meant in the context of a marriage that had just collapsed, an organization that had just been told she was a liability, and a woman who had spent 7 months constructing this specific outcome. For the moment, she said. She sent Petra the files. She made herself eat something, the second cold room service meal in 2 days, which was its own small indignity, and she sat by the window and watched the afternoon light move across the tops of the buildings, and felt the baby move against her ribs, the steady, interior insistence of a person who wanted to arrive and didn't understand yet what she was arriving into. It was almost 9 in the evening when her phone lit up with a message from a number she didn't have saved. No name, just a text, 6 words and a photograph, your mother. Tonight, bring the drive. The photograph showed her mother sitting in a chair in what appeared to be a large, dim room. Her hands were in her lap. Her expression was frightened, but controlled that particular controlled fear of a woman who had been told to sit still and had decided that sitting still was the most defiant thing available to her. Elara stood up from the chair so fast that her vision went briefly white at the edges. Her mother had gone to Cecile's. She had confirmed it. She had called her mother that morning, and her mother had said she was already there, already irritated about Cecile's cooking and the firmness of the guest mattress, which meant they had taken her from Cecile's apartment, which meant Serena had resources, as Elara had significantly underestimated, and she had been watching Elara's movements closely enough to know that the mother mattered, that she was the pressure point, the one person Elara would come out of cover for without calculating the risk first. She called the number. It rang 4 times and went to a mechanical voicemail. She called Gale. He picked up immediately. Mrs. Moretti. They have my mother, she said. Her voice was completely flat. Completely, without tremor. The steadiness had completed its transition into something harder than she'd expected to find in herself. Serena has my mother. A sharp intake of breath. Where? I don't know yet. She wants the drive. The encrypted drive with the financial records. Elara paused. Gale, I need you to tell Dante. Right now. Not through anyone else. You. Right now, Gale. A pause. Then the sound of movement, of a door, of footsteps. She heard Gale's voice at a distance. Then nothing. And then she stood at the window of the hotel room, with the phone pressed to her ear and her mother's frightened face still visible on her screen. And she made herself breathe, slow, controlled. One breath at a time because Myra needed oxygen, and Elara needed to be able to think. She pulled up a map. She thought about waterfront locations. About where you took someone in a city like New York when you needed a space that was large, abandoned, accessible by boat, and unlikely to attract attention on a rainy evening. She thought about what she knew of Serena's operational patterns, the careful logistics of a woman who planned for contingencies. And in the same moment, she identified the most probable location. She received a second text from the unknown number. Come alone. 2 hours. The Harrow Point Hotel. Abandoned. Waterfront. South of the Pier District, of course. Elara looked at the message. She looked at her mother's photograph. She looked at the window, at the city outside, at the rain that had started again sometime in the past hour, without her noticing. She picked up her coat. She did not call the police. Not because she didn't think about it, she did, for approximately 3 seconds, but because she understood, with the flat clarity of someone who had spent 6 years inside the machinery of how Dante's world actually operated, that calling the police would trigger a cascade of consequences that would destroy any remaining chance of resolving this without more damage than had already been done. That was Serena's secondary option, probably. Make Elara call the police, bring law enforcement into direct contact with Dante's operation at its most exposed moment, and watch the entire structure collapse from the outside while she slipped away through the financial chaos she'd already created. Elara took the encrypted drive from her laptop bag. She held it for a moment. Then she made a decision, the kind of decision that comes not from calculation, but from the place where everything you've been building toward becomes suddenly, irreversibly clear. She opened her laptop. She connected the drive. and she began the process of transmitting every file on it to a secure server she'd set up through Petra 2 years ago for document backup, with automatic forwarding instructions to Harlan Bryce and 2 independent investigators whose contact information she'd quietly compiled over the past 18 months. It took 11 minutes. Then she closed the laptop, put the empty drive in her coat pocket, picked up her phone, and walked to the door. She was going to walk into whatever Serena had prepared. She was going to do it alone, 8 months pregnant, in the rain, with an empty drive and the only leverage she had left. But she was not going to do it without making sure that even if everything went wrong, the truth had already left the building. She opened the hotel room door, and downstairs on the street, the rain was coming down hard enough that the sidewalk outside the Alderton's entrance looked like it was breathing. Water bouncing off the pavement in tiny explosions that caught the streetlight and scattered it in every direction. Elara stood under the overhang for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked into the rain. She didn't have an umbrella. She had her coat, her phone, the empty drive in her left pocket, and the particular stillness of a woman who has reduced every variable in her life down to a single point of motion. Move forward. Everything else was noise. She had 1 block of walking before Marco materialized from the parking structure across the street. He didn't say anything. He simply fell into step beside her, with the quiet, decided manner of a man who has made a choice and doesn't feel the need to explain it. And Elara looked at him once and understood that he had chosen and let him walk with her to the car. "Harrow Point," she said when they were inside. He nodded. Started the car, no questions. She looked out the window and watched the rain destroy the city's reflection on every wet surface it touched, and she thought about her mother's hands in the photograph folded in her lap, not clasped, just resting there. The way her mother's hands rested when she was making herself be still, when she was using every ounce of the particular stubbornness she had passed directly to her daughter to hold herself together in a room where she was frightened. Her mother was 63 years old. She had survived her husband leaving when Elara was 4, a breast cancer scare at 51, and 30 years of working a job that wore her body down in ways she never complained about, because complaining, in her mother's framework, was the same as admitting defeat. She was not fragile, but she was 63 and small and alone in a room, with people who used human beings as leverage, and Elara's chest was doing something complicated every time she thought about it. She pressed her hand to her side. Mira moved, a slow, rolling shift that felt almost deliberate, almost like something trying to say, "I'm here." "I know," Elara said under her breath. Marco glanced at her in the mirror but said nothing. The Harrow Point Hotel was a 15-minute drive south, through the Pier District and past the old industrial waterfront that the city had been trying and failing to redevelop for 20 years. It had been a mid-century luxury property once, the kind of place that hosted jazz musicians and shipping magnates and the particular class of New York money that no longer quite existed. Then it had been a convention hotel, then a budget property, then nothing. It had been empty for 4 years, the subject of competing renovation proposals and zoning disputes and the general entropy that swallowed large buildings when nobody with enough resources could agree on what to do with them. It was also, as Elara had understood the moment she read the address, a place where you could hold someone without the sound traveling anywhere that mattered. Marco stopped the car 2 blocks from the entrance. "I'm going alone from here," Elara said. "Mrs. Moretti." She said alone. "If she sees you, she'll know I didn't follow the instructions, and she'll use that. With respect, if you go in there alone—" "I know." She opened the door. Then stopped. "Turn back, Marco. Gail knows where I'm going. The moment you've dropped me, call him and tell him the exact address. Tell him to come with as many people as Dante will authorize, but quietly, because I need time inside before anyone moves." He stared at her. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who disapproves of a plan completely and is going to follow it anyway, because the person giving it has already made her decision and arguing is just delay. 10 minutes, he said. "After that, I'm calling." She nodded, got out of the car, walked the 2 blocks to the Harrow Point Hotel in the rain, alone, 8 months pregnant, with her coat pulled around her and her jaw set and her feet moving with a steadiness that she was building deliberately, one step at a time, because the alternative was to stop and acknowledge that she was terrified, and stopping was not available. The entrance was a set of large glass doors that had been chained but not locked. The padlock hung open, recently opened, which meant she was expected. She pushed through and stood in the lobby of what had once been an impressive space. High ceilings, a dead chandelier, the ghost of marble under years of dust. Everything smelled of old water and the particular cold of buildings that hadn't been heated in a long time. Her footsteps were too loud. She was aware of the sound they made and couldn't stop it without slowing to a shuffle. And slowing felt wrong, felt like arriving at a negotiation, already conceding something. She heard voices from the east corridor before she saw the light. A portable work lamp, the kind used by contractors, had been set up in what had once been a private dining room off the main lobby. The room was large, 8, maybe 10 meters across, with high windows that were boarded from the outside inside, and walls that still held the faint rectangular ghosts of paintings long removed. Her mother was sitting in a chair near the far wall. She was not bound. That was the first thing Elara registered, and some part of her chest unclenched by a fraction. Her mother was sitting in the chair the way she had been in the photograph, upright, hands in her lap, wearing the dark blue cardigan she always wore to Cecile's. It's because she said Cecile kept the apartment too cold. There was a bruise beginning on her left cheekbone that Elara's eyes went to and refused to leave. Standing to her mother's left was a man Elara didn't recognize. Large, quiet, the specific vacancy of expression that indicated professional rather than personal investment in being there. Standing in the center of the room in a charcoal coat that somehow managed to be unwrinkled, despite the rain, was Serena Vale. She looked, in the light of the work lamp, exactly as she always looked. Composed, specific, the careful beauty of someone who understands exactly how they appear and has mastered the management of that appearance as a primary professional tool. The diamond necklace was still at her throat. Elara stopped in the doorway. Neither woman spoke for a moment. They looked at each other across the dusty floor of the abandoned room, and the moment had a quality that Elara would think about. Later, a strange, heightened stillness, like the frame of a film held 1 second too long. "You came alone," Serena said. Not a question. Not quite surprised either, which told Elara that Serena had considered both possibilities and planned for them. "You have my mother," Elara said. "I do." Serena tilted her head slightly. "And you have something I need." Elara reached into her coat pocket. She took out the drive and held it up, and Serena's eyes went to it with an attention that told Elara everything about how much the files on that drive mattered to her. Not just strategically. Personally, the drive contained the evidence of 7 months of work, and Serena looked at it the way people look at things they have spent a very long time building. "My mother walks out of here first," Elara said. Serena smiled. It was not a warm smile, and it was not quite a cold one either. It was the smile of someone watching a sequence unfold according to their design and finding the experience mildly satisfying. That's not how this works. That's the only way this works. Serena glanced at the man standing beside Elara's mother. A small movement, barely perceptible. The man put his hand on the back of the chair. Elara's mother looked up at Elara. Her eyes were steady. Frightened underneath, but steady on the surface, the same eyes that had watched Elara's father leave and had not cried until after he was gone and the door closed. Because there were things you didn't let people see if you could help it. "Elara," her mother said. Her voice was even. "Don't you dare give her anything." "Mom, I mean it." "Don't you dare. Nobody asked you." Serena said, without heat, the way you make a factual correction. Something moved in Elara's chest that was not calm and not fear and not grief, but something older and more fundamental, the animal reflex of a woman between a threat and the people she carries in her body, her living daughter on one side and her mother across the room, and the need to place herself between both of them and everything harmful in the world, which was not physically possible and therefore lived in her as a pressure she had to manage rather than an action she could take. "Give me the drive," Serena said, "and you both leave." Elara looked at her. "Tell me why you did it." A pause. Small amusement crossed Serena's face, the kind that appears when someone finds a question marginally more interesting than they expected. Does it matter? Humor me. Serena considered this for a moment. Then she lifted one shoulder, a small and elegant gesture of concession. Because he was available, she said. And because you were. She looked at Elara with the specific clinical assessment of someone studying an obstacle, not paying attention to how exposed you were. That's not an explanation. That's a summary. Fine. Serena walked a slow half circle, not toward Elara, just moving the movement of someone comfortable in a space, which was its own form of control. Your husband's operation had a structural vulnerability that I identified before I ever walked through his door. His loyalty network was built entirely on fear and financial dependency. The moment those two things were questioned simultaneously, the whole structure would destabilize. All I had to do was introduce the questions. She said it plainly. Not gloating, exactly. More like explaining a process that she found professionally clean, and was therefore willing to describe with a certain detached satisfaction. The affair, Elara said, was a tool. Serena stopped walking. I needed access to his personal trust. The fastest route to a man like Dante Moretti's personal trust is through his ego. He wants to be admired by someone he believes has no reason to perform admiration. A pause. You had stopped performing it, incidentally. He told me that himself. Elara felt that land but didn't let it show. And Victor called her. Victor provided resources and a secondary exit strategy. If Dante survived the internal destabilization, the external war would finish the job. Either way, the legitimate businesses which you very helpfully organized into a beautiful, accessible structure drain out through the shell accounts. And, by the time anyone traces the full picture, I'm somewhere that doesn't have an extradition agreement with New York. She said it all with the same clean, explanatory tone. No performance, no malice in the theatrical sense. Just the account of a strategy, given to someone who would have appreciated the strategy if she hadn't been the primary obstacle in it. He thinks I'm a federal informant, Elara said. Yes. You told his partners that, this morning. I needed them focused on you rather than on the account movements. A slight pause. I also told him you've been planning to leave since before the pregnancy. That the baby was your leverage strategy. Elara stared at her. Not with rage. With something colder than rage, the particular look that comes when you hear something said about yourself that is so specifically designed to destroy trust that it becomes almost impressive in its cruelty, the way a very precise weapon is almost impressive before it hits you. He believed that, Elara said. It came out flat. He believed it enough to freeze your accounts and lock the house. Serena's voice was matter of fact, which tells you something about the marriage you were defending. Elara said nothing. Her mother made a sound in the chair, low, sharp, the sound swallowing something she would have said if the situation allowed it. The drive, Serena said. Her voice had shifted slightly. The conversational window was closing. I've answered your questions. I'm not a patient woman by nature, and we've been here long enough. Elara looked at the drive in her hand. She thought about the 11 minutes of transmission time. She thought about the secure server and the automatic forwarding, and Harlan Bryce's inbox and the two independent investigators whose contact information she had compiled over 18 months of quiet, careful preparation for a contingency she had hoped would never be necessary. She thought about the fact that the drive was empty. She held it out. Serena crossed the room and took it from her hand with the same directness. She did everything, no hesitation, no ceremony. She turned it over once, examining it. Then she looked at Elara with an expression that was sharp and suspicious, and about 2 seconds from becoming something else. A reader, she said to the man by the chair. She didn't look at him. He moved. Elara's heart rate did something. She controlled her face. The man produced a laptop from a bag near the wall. He plugged the drive in. He typed. He waited. The room was very quiet. Rain against the boarded windows. The lamp's hum. Elara's own breathing, which she was managing with deliberate, regular effort. The man looked up at Serena, empty. The word landed in the room like a stone into still water. Serena turned her head toward Elara very slowly. The composure was still there. It would always be there. It was structural, it was bone deep, but something behind it had shifted. The calculation was still running, but the variables had changed, and Serena was processing that with the rapid, cold efficiency of someone who plans for contingencies and has just encountered one she didn't fully anticipate. "Where are the files?" she said. "Sent, Elara," she said. One word. Completely steady. Something moved across Serena's face that was not quite panic and not quite anger, but a controlled, intense version of both, the expression of a person watching they have spent 7 months building begin to fracture at a point they had not adequately fortified. "To whom?" she said. "Harlan Bryce. 2 independent investigators who have been quietly building a parallel case on Victor Calder's financial network for the past 14 months. And to a forensic accountant who will have completed her own analysis of the shell account structure by morning." Serena looked at her. Elara looked back. And in the silence between them, something completed its final configuration: 2 women who had been occupying the same space for 7 months without ever being in the same room, and the specific, irreversible recognition of 2 people seeing each other clearly for the first time. "You did that before you came here," Serena said. "Yes." "Before you knew if your mother was—" "Yes." A pause. "Because if I'd waited until I knew she was safe, I might have made a different decision. And I couldn't afford to make a different decision." Her mother made a sound, not distress. Something that might, under other circumstances, have been described as a suppressed note of pride. Serena took a breath, controlled, deliberate. The breath of a woman restructuring, rapidly, from a plan that has failed to the best available alternative. "Then we have a different problem," she said. "We have several," Elara agreed. "Sit down," Serena said. "No," a pause. "That wasn't a request." "I know." Elara held her position in the doorway. Her feet were starting to ache, the pregnancy pressure that traveled from the base of her spine through her hips when she stood too long, and she refused to show it. "I came here for my mother. The files are already gone. You can't undo the transmission. Your only available move is whether you let us walk out of here before the people who are currently approximately 8 minutes away arrive and remove the choice from your hands entirely." Serena went very still. "Who's coming?" "Gail Reyes." "And however many men Dante authorized." She paused. "I told Marco to call when he dropped me off." The calculation behind Serena's eyes ran fast and visible. Not visible in the sense of panicked, but visible in the sense of rapid, the specific velocity of a tactical mind hitting a wall and immediately scanning left and right for the gap. She looked at the man by the chair. Something passed between them. Not words, not even quite a look. Just the signal of 2 people who have worked together long enough to communicate in shorthand. The man reached into his jacket. Elara moved. She didn't think about it. It was instinctive, the step back, the positioning of herself in the doorway, the physical logic of a woman who understood that the doorway was the only defensible position she had, and that she had to hold it because behind her was the corridor, and behind the corridor was the exit, and behind the exit was a car 2 blocks away. "Don't," Serena said. To the man, not to Elara. He stopped. Serena turned back to Elara, and now there was something new in her face, not softness, nothing so simple, but a shift in register. The performance layer had thinned slightly, and underneath it was something that was genuine. And what was genuine? Well, it was a woman who was also calculating survival, whose plan had failed, and who was now doing the specific math of the available outcomes. "What happens to me," Serena said, "if I let you take her?" Elara looked at her steadily. "That depends on what you've done that I don't know about yet." A long silence. "Victor's operation," Serena said. Careful, deliberate. Like someone offering something they have spent a long time not offering. "I have the full communication record. Everything he's done in the past 18 months. The warehouse, 2 other operations, names, dates, locations. You'd give that up. If there's something in it for me." Her eyes were direct. "I'm not loyal to Victor. I was never loyal to anyone in this. I want out. Somewhere that isn't a federal prosecution." Elara said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's not my decision to make." "Then whose is it? Right now?" Elara glanced toward the corridor, toward the distant sound rain, or something else, something moving outside the building. "Dante's." Serena looked at her with an expression, that contained several things simultaneously, and that Elara, in a different life, in a context without all of this between them, might have recognized as the expression of a woman who has been many things and found that none of them provided what she expected. "He won't deal with me," Serena said. "Maybe not." Elara paused. "But I will." Another silence, longer. The lamp hummed. Something rattled in the building's frame wind or age, or the collective weight of what was happening inside it. Then the sound that wasn't rain resolved itself into footsteps. Multiple, moving fast through the corridor outside the room, and the specific quality of organized, purposeful movement that Elara had heard enough times in 3 years of Dante's world to recognize without seeing it. Serena turned toward the sound. The man beside her mother reached into his jacket again. "Tell him to stop," Elara said. Serena said nothing. "Serena." Alara's voice cut clean and flat through the room. "Tell him to stop right now, because the men coming through that corridor are not going to knock." A beat too. Then Serena lifted her hand, a small gesture, and the man lowered his. The door at the far end of the dining room came open. Gale came through first, not because he was the most physically imposing, though he was, but because that was how Gale moved through any space, with the settled, bovine authority of a man who has never in his adult life needed to run, and has therefore never quite learned to do anything other than walk through things. Behind him were 4 men Elara recognized from Dante's security team. And behind them, in the doorway, coat soaked from the rain and dark hair wet against his forehead, and an expression on his face that she had never seen there before, not rage, not the controlled authority she associated with him, but something rawer and less managed than either of those things was Dante. He took in the room in the way he always took in rooms, fast, comprehensive, the involuntary assessment of a man trained to read spaces for danger. He took in Serena. He took in the man beside the chair. He took in Elara's mother. He took in Elara, and his face did something complicated. She couldn't name it precisely. It was the face of a man who has been operating on one version of reality for too long and has just arrived somewhere that makes that version untenable. And the untenable thing is not a surprise exactly, but the confrontation with it is still something that costs him. "Elara," he said. "She's been holding my mother," Elara said. Her voice was steady and direct, and contained none of the 1,000 other things that wanted to come out of her in this room, in this moment, standing wet and 8 months pregnant in an abandoned hotel, while her husband looked at her with that expression on his face. "Since this afternoon, to get the financial files." He looked at Serena. Serena looked back at him. And for a long moment, they looked at each other, the man who had believed her, and the woman who had used that belief, and whatever Dante saw in her face in that moment, whatever resolved itself for him in those 3 or 4 seconds, it resolved completely because she watched his expression close. Not toward anger, toward something past anger. "Get her mother out of here," he said. To Gale. Still looking at Serena, Gale moved immediately, crossing to the chair, crouching to speak quietly to Elara's mother, offering his hand. Her mother looked at it for a moment, then at Elara, then at Gale. "I'm fine," her mother said, with the specific dignity of a woman who will accept help exactly once and would like it noted that she is perfectly capable. She took Gale's hand and stood and walked with him toward the corridor. She passed Elara in the doorway and stopped. She put her hand on the side of Elara's face, her cold, dry palm against Elara's wet cheek, and held it there for a moment. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Then she walked out with Gale. The room contracted. 5 of Dante's men, Serena and her associate, Elara in the doorway, and Dante, who had crossed the room without Elara registering the movement, who was now standing closer than she'd expected, close enough that she could see the water on his jacket, the exhaustion around his eyes, the particular set of his jaw that she knew, in the way you know someone's face after 6 years, meant that he was holding himself very deliberately in check. "The files," he said quietly to Elara. "You sent them. Before I came here to Bryce. And 2 investigators. And a forensic accountant who will have the shell account analysis complete by morning." Something moved across his face. "The warehouse records were fabricated. The evidence against me was put there by her before the fire." She held his gaze. Dante, I know you've spent 2 days believing things about me that aren't true. I don't have the space right now to tell you how that felt. But the files are sent, and the investigators have them, and the only question left tonight is what you do with her. He turned to look at Serena. Serena, for the first time since Elara had entered this building, looked like someone who was doing the specific work of remaining composed in a situation that had stopped being composed. She was still upright, still controlled, still carrying the architecture of a woman who has performed this well for long enough that it had become reflexive. But underneath it, Elara could see the first evidence of something giving way. She offered information on Victor, Elara said, the full communication record. 18 months. In exchange for whatever arrangement she can negotiate. Dante was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Serena and said, in the flattest tone Elara had ever heard from him, "You told me she was feeding information to federal investigators." Serena said nothing. "You told me she had been planning to leave since before the pregnancy." A pause. That the baby was leverage. Still nothing. "You told me," he said, and now the flatness was something else, something that moved through the room like a change in pressure, that the men I've worked with for 15 years were planning to move against me. Serena met his eyes, and in her expression was something that Elara had not expected, and that Dante clearly hadn't either, because it wasn't guilt and it wasn't fear, it was a kind of composed, almost resigned directness. The expression of someone who has been caught and has decided that the most functional response is to stop pretending. "They weren't," Serena said, "but they would have been, eventually. Everybody moves against power eventually. I just accelerated the timeline." The room went absolutely silent. Dante stared at her. And Elara watched him, in that silence, watched him process the full weight of what had just been said, the structure of it, the scope, the 7 of sustained and specific manipulation, and watched the moment when he understood not just that he had been used, but how completely, and that the woman standing in front of him had looked at everything he was, everything he had built, everything he cared about, and had seen only a mechanism. One of his men started forward. Dante raised one hand. Just one hand at his side. The man stopped. Dante turned to look at Elara. She looked back at him, wet, exhausted, 8 months pregnant with their daughter. Standing in the doorway of an abandoned building in the rain at 10:30 in the evening, because there had been no other way to get to this moment, and she had needed to get to this moment more than she had needed anything in recent memory. "She wants a deal," Elara said. "Victor's full operation in exchange for whatever she can negotiate with the investigators." A pause. "I told her that wasn't my decision to make." He held her gaze for a long moment. "No," he said. "It's not." He looked at his men, then back at Serena. "You're going to write down everything you know about Victor's operation," he said. "Every name, every date, every location. And then my attorney is going to be present when you give it to the federal investigators, who have apparently been building a case for 16 months. A pause. "Because unlike you, I've decided I want this done in a way that doesn't require me to put bodies in the water." He said it quietly. No performance, just the statement of a decision. Serena looked at him for a long time, then she nodded once. The composed, small nod of a woman accepting terms. Dante turned back toward the door, toward Elara. He stopped close to her. Too close for a conversation that wasn't personal, which was something that couldn't be helped in this room, in this moment. "You transmitted everything before you knew if she had hurt her," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something he was working out. "Yes," Elara said, knowing that if something had happened, the truth still needed to be out there. She paused. "The evidence was more important than the leverage. I needed you to have the information, regardless of what happened to me in here." He was quiet. "Dante." She said his name carefully. "The way you handle something that has been under enormous pressure." "She's fine. My mother is fine. The files are sent. It's done." He looked at her face. The bruise on her mother's cheek, which was not on Elara's face, but might as well have been for the way it had traveled into the room with her and lived there in the space between them. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, no qualifiers, no justification attached. Just the words, dropped into the air between them, with the weight of everything they were meant to carry. Elara held his gaze for a moment. Then she stepped to the side, out of the doorway. "Get me out of this building," she said. He moved. He moved the way he always moved, when the decision had been made, without hesitation, without ceremony, toward the door, and Elara followed him. And behind her she heard the sounds of his men moving Serena toward whatever was next. And the rain was still coming down outside the building's entrance. Still indifferent, still continuous. And then the cold air hit Elara's face, and she stopped walking for a second, and put both hands on her stomach, and breathed. Everything hurt. Her back, her feet, the place in her chest where the marriage lived. The smaller, sharper place where trust had been, and was now something more complicated and less named. Dante stopped 2 steps ahead of her, turned back. He looked at where her hands were resting. Then he took 1 step toward her, and she felt the movement before she fully processed it. Not a gesture, not a word, just the simple physics of him closing distance. And she was tired enough, and the night had been long enough that she let him, because her body had made the decision before her mind caught up with it. He put his hands over hers, over the place where Mira was. Neither of them spoke. The rain came down. And then, because the night was not finished, and the world does not pause, for the moments that deserve it, Elara felt something shift, not emotionally, not metaphorically, but physically. A long, slow cramp that started at her lower back and moved forward, different from the general ache of pregnancy, different from anything she had felt before. Different enough that she went still in a way that Dante, his hand still over hers, felt immediately. He pulled back to look at her face. "Elara, I'm fine," she said. The automatic response, the first-line reflex. But her face said something else. And Dante had spent 6 years learning her face. "What is it?" he said. Not a question. The low, direct demand of a man trying not to start being afraid. She opened her mouth to say nothing. "I'm fine, it's just stress," because that was the rational thing. That was probably true. That was the sentence that would allow this moment to resolve into something manageable. And then the second cramp came, harder than the first, and her breath caught in a way she couldn't control, and the expression that crossed her face in that involuntary, unguarded second was the answer to every question he'd been asking. "We need a hospital," she said. Dante's hand found her arm. Behind them, in the abandoned building, Serena was being managed by men following orders. Ahead of them, somewhere in the city, Gail was in a car with her mother. Around them, the rain was coming down on a waterfront that smelled of old water and cold stone. And Dante Moretti, who had walked into a room full of armed men without flinching 100 times, who had never in Elara's memory looked truly frightened, looked frightened. Not the managed professional wariness he wore in rooms where the danger was external and predictable. Something that went deeper than that. Something that lived in the face of a man who has just understood, in one unguarded second, that there are situations in which his particular set of capabilities is entirely useless. He couldn't negotiate with this. He couldn't buy it, or threaten it, or outmaneuver it with better information. He could only move. "Marco," he said loud, across the rain and the distance. The car had pulled up at some point, Marco out of it already, standing at the edge of the pavement. "Hospital. Now." Marco was already moving to the door. Dante got his arm around Elara's back, not the careful, deferential half-touch of 2 days ago, but something more absolute, his hand flat against her side, taking weight, taking the decision about where she was going next, completely out of the air between them. "I can walk," she said. "I know you can." He walked with her anyway. She didn't argue, because the second cramp had faded into a low grinding pressure that was not fading completely, and her body was doing something that her mind hadn't finished accepting yet, and the car was 6 steps away. And some part of Elara Vaughn had simply reached the end of the amount of things she could manage simultaneously in one night. She got in the car. Dante got in beside her. Marco drove. And the city went past the windows in the rain, indifferent and enormous, and Elara sat with both hands pressed to her stomach and her head back against the seat, and her eyes open, watching the lights in New York slide across the glass, and thought about nothing at all, because thinking about nothing was the only way to stay inside the boundary of what she could control. Dante's hand found hers in the dark of the back seat. She didn't move it away. The emergency entrance at St. Luca's Medical Center was 30 years old and looked at the kind of institutional infrastructure that had been added to and modified so many times that it no longer had a coherent architectural identity, just the accumulated urgency of a building that had been solving immediate problems for 3 decades. The lights were the particular brutal fluorescent of medical spaces that do not have the luxury of ambiances, and the smell was antiseptic and floor cleaner, and the faint, unmistakable undercurrent of everything hospitals actually do. They came through the doors at 11:14, Dante with his hand at Elara's back, and Marco one step behind, and Elara herself moving steadily because she was still choosing to move steadily, even though her lower back was doing something that was escalating with a tempo she didn't like. A nurse met them at the desk. She looked at Elara, visibly 8 months pregnant, visibly wet, visibly doing the specific controlled breathing of a woman managing pain she hasn't fully acknowledged yet, and she did not waste time. "How far apart?" she said. "I don't know," Elara said. "Maybe 8 minutes. Maybe less." "No, but there was blood." "Earlier, she said it flat, at the hotel. Not much." "Enough." The nurse's expression didn't change, but her pace did. She was already reaching for a chair, already calling over her shoulder, already initiating the quiet and rapid machinery of a maternity emergency. Dante was at Elara's shoulder. "She's 34 weeks, he said. "She's been under significant physical stress tonight." The nurse glanced at him once, briefly, with the professional assessment of a woman who has worked emergency admissions long enough to identify the categories of men who show up in this way: frightened husband, present for the first time at the reality of a crisis he has somehow not been managing, and then looked back at Elara. "Is this your support person?" she asked Elara. Elara looked at Dante. The question was logistical. It was also in the context of the past 72 hours, something more than that. "Yes," she said. They moved her fast. A wheelchair, a corridor, a room that was already set up because rooms like this were always set up, always waiting. Monitors attached. Blood pressure cuff. The fetal heartbeat coming through the monitor speaker, fast, insistent, real. And Elara heard it and felt something in her chest release by exactly 1 degree. The single degree that corresponded to, she's still there, she's still going. The attending physician was a woman named Dr. Reeves, late 40s, the specific competent brevity of someone who has been delivering premature and complicated babies long enough that she has burned through all the unnecessary words. She examined Elara with the same clean efficiency, asked questions in short bursts, received answers, processed them. "Placental abruption," she said, not to the room, to Elara directly. Looking at her. "Small, right now. But the bleeding and the stress indicators mean we're not waiting. We're going to prep for an emergency cesarean." Elara held her gaze. "How small is small? Small enough that we have time to do this right. Not small enough to wait." A pause. "Just a fraction. Your daughter is at 34 weeks. Her lungs are developed enough. We have a good NICU team. You are going to be fine, and she is going to be fine. But I need you with me for the next hour." Elara nodded, once. The nod of a woman who has been managing crises for 3 days and has now arrived at the one she can't manage, and has decided that the only available response is to trust someone who knows what they're doing. "Okay," she said. They began prepping the room. A second nurse appeared. Someone spoke to Dante in the doorway. She couldn't hear what was said. She was watching the monitor, watching Mira's heartbeat move across the screen in its fast, small waves, and then Dante was beside her. Not at the foot of the bed, beside it, at the level of her shoulder, where she could see him without turning. "They're going to ask you to wait outside," she said. "I know." Dante, she found his eyes. "She's going to be fine." He looked back at her, and his face was doing the thing it had been doing since the waterfront, the unmanaged version, the one she rarely got to see, the one that lived underneath all the control and the authority, and the specific performance of a man who has never allowed himself to appear as anything other than in command. "You don't know that," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I'm telling you anyway." Something moved in his face that she couldn't name and didn't try to. Then Dr. Reeves was back, and the room was moving at a different speed, and Dante stepped back, and the last thing Elara saw before the focus narrowed down to the room and the monitors and the specific work of the next hour was his face in the doorway, pale, controlled, present before the door closed between them. The corridor outside the operating room was the specific hell of waiting in a building designed for emergencies, which is to say, it was ordinary. Linoleum, overhead lighting, a water fountain that made a sound every few minutes, chairs along one wall that were slightly too low for a man Dante's height, which meant he did not sit in them. He stood. Gail arrived at 11:52 with Elara's mother, who had been treated at a secondary facility for the bruise on her cheek and 2 bruised ribs she hadn't mentioned to anyone till a nurse pressed on her side and she made a sound. She came through the corridor doors, still in her dark blue cardigan. Gail one step behind, with the careful proximity of a man who has been assigned to protect something that he has decided he will take personally. She saw Dante before he saw her. She stopped. Dante turned. They looked at each other, the mother-in-law and the man who had, in the past 48 hours, frozen her daughter's accounts and locked her out of her house, and believed, for an extended and consequential period of time, the wrong person. The corridor was fluorescent and merciless, and offered no cover for what either of their faces was doing. Dante spoke first. "She's in surgery," he said. "The baby is there doing a cesarean." The doctor stopped. Started again. Dr. Reeves said small abruption. "She said they have time to do it properly." Elara's mother looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked past him without speaking and sat down in one of the chairs along the wall, folded her hands in her lap, and fixed her eyes on the door to the operating room. Dante stayed where he was. Gail moved to stand near the water fountain, with the expression of a man who has learned, over many years of difficult rooms, when to be invisible. 40 minutes passed. Dante did not sit. He stood at various points in the corridor, sometimes near the door, sometimes near the far wall, sometimes in the middle of the linoleum floor, with his hands in his jacket pockets and his head slightly down, and the posture of a man who is using every resource available to him to hold very still. He was still in his wet jacket. At some point he had pushed the sleeves up and then pushed them back down. His shirt at the collar was damp from the rain, and there was a mark on his left cuff that he didn't look at because looking at it would require acknowledging where it had come from. Elara's mother said nothing to him. She said nothing to anyone. She watched the door. At 12:31, it opened. Dr. Reeves came through it, with her mask pulled down to her chin. And her expression, Dante read her expression before she spoke, the way he had learned to read every room he walked into. From the position of bodies and the set of faces was tired and direct, and not carrying the particular weight of bad news. "Both stable," she said. She said it to the room, but she looked at Dante and then at Elara's mother in sequence, because she was a woman who understood that both people in this corridor had a specific stake. "Your daughter had some distress during delivery, but she's breathing on her own. We have her in the NICU as a precaution. She's small, but she's strong." A slight pause. "Your wife's significant blood loss, which we managed. She'll be in recovery for a few hours. She's asking for her mother." The last sentence was directed at Elara's mother, who stood up from the chair immediately, without ceremony, without looking at Dante, and followed Dr. Reeves through the door. The door closed. Dante stood in the corridor alone. He stood there for a long time. The water fountain made its sound. The overhead light hummed at a frequency he became aware of because the corridor was very quiet and his nervous system was doing something complex that required quiet to process. He reached into his jacket, took out his phone. He had 17 messages from Gail, from the senior partners, from his attorney Harlan Bryces, from a number he didn't recognize that was almost certainly one of the independent investigators Elara had mentioned. He looked at the messages without opening them. Then he put the phone back in his pocket. He sat down in one of the chairs that were too low. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he stayed there for a while. Gail, from his position near the water fountain, did not speak, did not approach, simply remained with the particular loyalty of a man who has been in enough difficult rooms to understand that sometimes presence is the only appropriate form of support. When Dante lifted his head, his face was composed again. Not the full composition, not the performance he wore, for rooms full of people who needed to be managed. Something quieter than that, the functional composure of a man who has moved through something and is now on the other side of it and has not yet decided what the outside looks like. The file she sent to Bryce, he said. To Gail. Yes, sir. Has he reviewed it? He called me at 11. He said. Gail paused. Chose his words with the care he always used when delivering information that was going to be uncomfortable. He said the evidence against Mrs. Moretti is clearly fabricated. The metadata on the documents found in the warehouse shows they were created 6 weeks ago on a device registered to an S. A pause. He also said the shell account analysis is comprehensive enough that the federal investigators who've been working the shipping subsidiary case will almost certainly redirect their focus significantly once they see it. Dante looked at the floor. She built the case, he said. Quiet, flat. Not a question, Mrs. Moretti. Yes, sir. While she was in the hotel, she built the full case from documents she'd been preserving for months. Gail paused again. And then she transmitted everything, before she went to the Harrow Point building. Before she knew the outcome. Dante said nothing. She put the truth out there, Gail said, before she made sure she was going to survive the night. The water fountain made its sound. I know, Dante said. At 2 in the morning, a nurse came to tell him that the NICU would allow one visitor. Just one, just briefly, because the baby was doing well, but she was small, and the NICU was a careful place. He went. He had to put on a gown. He had to wash his hands at the scrub station with the specific thoroughness the nurse demonstrated, and he did it exactly as she showed him, which was the most careful he had been about anything in recent memory. Then he followed her through a door into a room that was warm and quiet, and full of the particular orchestrated calm of a space where very small things are being kept safe. Elara Moretti was in an incubator in the 3rd bay. She was very small. He had known, in the abstract way that you know things before they become real, that 34 weeks meant small. But the abstract and the real were two different experiences. And the real was he stood at the incubator and looked at her, and the real was something he didn't have language for. She was red and creased, and her eyes were closed, and she had a monitor attached, and a feeding tube and a knit cap on her head that someone had put there, some nurse, someone who understood that small new people needed warmth in specific places. Her hands were at her sides, the fingers curled slightly, the nails already present and impossibly small. She looked the way that very new people look, which is to say like someone who has just arrived from a very long distance and hasn't quite oriented yet. Dante stood at the incubator with his hands at his sides because the nurse had explained carefully what he could and couldn't touch, and he was following the instructions exactly. And he looked at his daughter, and his daughter breathed small, steady present, and he stood there while something moved through him that he had no framework for and made no effort to contain. He was not a man who cried easily. He was, in fact, a man who had spent considerable effort over his adult life, ensuring that crying was not something that happened where it could be observed, but in the warm quiet of the NICU with his daughter, breathing in the 3rd bay, and no one in the room except a nurse at the far end who was giving him the specific professional privacy of someone looking the other way. Something in his chest came apart in the particular way of things that have been under pressure for too long. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there with his hands at his sides, and his face doing something he'd stopped. And he let it happen because there was no one here to manage it for, and because his daughter was breathing and Elara was alive, and the corridor outside had been the closest he had come in 39 years of living in a world where danger was the ambient condition to something he genuinely couldn't survive. He stayed for 11 minutes. Then the nurse indicated gently that it was time, and he thanked her, and he went back out into the corridor. At 4:17 in the morning, they let him into the recovery room. Elara's mother was in the chair by the bed, asleep in the precise upright way of a woman who has learned to rest, wherever rest is available, without surrendering her posture. The room was dim and quiet. The monitors were soft. The IV line ran from Elara's arm to a bag of something clear and steadily dripping. Elara was awake. She looked at him when he came through the door. She looked the way you look after surgery and significant blood loss, And a night that had contained more than any night should pale, precise, worn to something that was still her, but thinner than usual, less armored. The careful architecture of the face she showed the world had been temporarily set aside because she was too tired to wear it and was in a room where, for the next few hours at least, she didn't have to. He came to the chair beside the bed and sat down. "She's beautiful," he said. Elara's expression did something. "You saw her. They let me in for a few minutes. He paused. "She has your hands." Elara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the ceiling as he watched her throat move, and she pressed her lips together briefly before she spoke again. "The nurse said she's breathing on her own." "She is. That's the important thing." A pause. "That's the only important thing right now." He sat with that, with the truth of it, which was clean and simple, and cut directly through everything else in the room. "The partners are going to want a meeting," he said, "once Bryce has briefed them on the file." "I know. The federal case, Harlan can handle it." She turned her head to look at him. "The evidence is clean. The fabrication is provable. Victor's operation is fully documented in Serena's communication records." A pause. "You're going to have a difficult few months. But the structure I built was sound. The legitimate businesses will survive it." He looked at her. "You built it to survive," he said. "I built it for Mira." She held his gaze. "I was always building it for her." He said nothing for a moment. Outside the room, the hospital moved in its perpetual, undramatic way soft footsteps. A distant announcement, the machinery of a building doing what it was built to do. "I believed her," he said. Elara didn't respond immediately. She looked at the ceiling again, at the specific neutral beige of a hospital ceiling that has absorbed a significant amount of human difficulty over the years. "I know," she said. "I want to explain, not tonight." The words were quiet, but they were final. "Not in this room tonight. I don't have the capacity for it right now, and I don't want to say things in this room that belong somewhere else." Pause. A pause. "Dante, she found the crack and she used it. That's what she does. But the crack was real, and that's what we have to eventually sit with." He absorbed that. "Yes," he said, "it is." Her mother shifted in the chair, settled back without waking. "Go home," Elara said. "Sleep. Come back in the morning." She paused. "Come back for her." "And for you?" She looked at him. The exhaustion was total and genuine, but underneath it, something else lived that was complicated and not resolved, and that both of them understood was going to take considerably longer than one night in a hospital recovery room to address. Wilsey said. He nodded, stood. He looked at her face for a moment, longer than was strictly necessary, with the attention of a man cataloging something he is afraid of losing, which was new, which was not something Dante Moretti had historically allowed himself to do. Then he walked to the door. "Dante," she said. He stopped. "The warehouse," she said. "The one your father built." "Yes. When this is over and the dust settles, rebuild it." A pause. "But put it in her name." He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "Okay," and walked out. The next several weeks moved at the pace that medical and legal crises move fast in some places and agonizingly slow in others, with no respect for the emotional timeline of the people living through them. Mira came off the NICU monitors after 9 days and continued, with the focused determination of someone who had made up her mind before she arrived, to be exactly as strong as Dr. Reeves had predicted. She ate. She slept. She accumulated grams of weight with the steady intentionality of someone preparing for something. Serena Vale was arrested at the Harrow Point building by investigators who had been monitoring Victor Calder's network and who received, in the early hours of the morning following the confrontation, a data package from Harlan Bryce's office that redirected their investigation in ways they had not anticipated, and that resulted, over the following weeks, in a cascade of arrests that dismantled the better part of Victor's operational infrastructure. Serena cooperated. Not out of remorse. Elara never saw evidence of remorse from Serena and had stopped expecting it, but out of the same functional calculation that had governed every decision she'd made. Cooperation was the best available option, so she took it. She gave them everything she'd told Elara she would give them, and the investigators found it comprehensive and useful and proceeded accordingly. Victor Calder was arrested at his home in Connecticut on a Tuesday morning that was described later as quiet and routine, which seemed appropriate for the end of something that had caused a great deal of noise. The charges against Elara, which had never been formally filed, because the fabricated evidence had not survived. Harlan Bryce's analysis were formally cleared in a document that Elara read once. At her kitchen table in the apartment she had rented, after leaving the hotel, sixum and then filed in a folder with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Dante restructured. It was not simple, and it was not quick, and it involved the kind of confrontations with the remaining members of his organization that Elara was not present for and did not ask about. What she knew was what was visible, the legitimate businesses continuing, the violent operations being methodically wound down, the process of a man doing what he had said he would do without announcement or performance, simply doing it. He came for Mira twice a week. He came on time. He sent no gifts designed to communicate what words wouldn't. He did not use their daughter as a vehicle for access. He sat on the floor of Elara's apartment. He sat on the floor of Elara's tenderness and of a man learning how to hold something without controlling it. And he stayed for the time that was agreed upon and left when it was over. 3 months in, Elara's mother came to stay for a week. She arrived with a bag too large for 1 week because she had never packed light in her life and did not intend to start. She made food that filled the apartment with warmth and smell and the particular domestic gravity of a woman reclaiming space. She held Mira with the ease of someone who had been waiting to do this since before the baby arrived. On the 4th evening of that week, she sat across from Elara at the kitchen table after Mira was asleep, with 2 cups of tea and the unhurried attention of a woman who has been waiting to say something and has decided that tonight is when she will say it. "The bruise is gone," she said, touching her own cheekbone briefly. "I know," Elara said. "The ribs took longer. I know that too." Her mother wrapped both hands around her cup. "You saved him," she said. "You know that. Everything you did, the documents, the transmission, going to that building, you saved his businesses, and probably his freedom." "I know, he knows it too." Elara looked at her tea. "Mom, I'm not telling you to go back." Her mother's voice was even and direct. "I'm telling you what happened, what you did. Because sometimes we do things in the middle of a crisis, and then we don't let ourselves fully see them afterward." A pause. "You walked into that building to save your mother, and you sent the files first, because you understood that the truth was more important than your own safety. That's the person you are." She paused again. "Don't spend so much time deciding what Dante deserves that you forget to decide what you want." Elara was quiet. Outside the apartment window, New York was doing what it always did, existing at full volume, indifferent, continuous, completely uninterested in the interior weather of any individual life, happening inside any individual window. "I don't know what I want yet," Elara said, honestly. Her mother nodded. "Then take the time." She did. A year is not a long time, and it is also an enormous amount of time, depending on what happens in it. And what happened in that year was that Elara von Moretti built something, not a case, not a confrontation, not a strategy, but a life. Small and specific and genuinely hers. The apartment with the good light in the mornings. The work she returned to freelance at first, then consulting, then something larger that grew out of the reputation she'd built through the financial analysis that had, when the dust settled, been the center of a federal investigation that made a significant number of headlines. The particular satisfaction of a woman doing the work she was actually built to do, for herself, without it being filtered through anyone else's empire. Mira grew. She acquired over that year opinions about colors and specific food preferences, and the early, emphatic personality of someone who was going to take up exactly the amount of space she wanted. She had Elara's hands. She had Dante's eyes. She had something in the set of her jaw that seemed to belong only to herself. Dante came. He always came on time. He always left when he was supposed to. He did not argue about the boundaries. He did not test them. He did not send intermediaries or attorneys to renegotiate arrangements in ways that happened to give him more access. He followed the structure exactly and without visible resentment, which was the most important thing, and also so. Elara knew Not an easy thing for a man who had spent his entire adult life believing that control was the appropriate response to uncertainty. He was learning, that she could see. Whether it was enough, and for what, was a question she was not ready to answer. Then he asked her to dinner, not through Gail, not through Harlan Bryce, or any other intermediary. A text from his number, direct and unembellished. Dinner. Bellavere. Whenever you're ready, no agenda. I'll be there. She read it twice. She set the phone down. She picked Mira up from the rug, where she was conducting a serious and apparently urgent investigation of a wooden toy, and she held her daughter against her chest and stood at the window and thought about it. She called her mother. Bellavere, her mother said. Yes, a pause, the same table, presumably. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, well, that's either brave or stupid, I know. Which do you think? Elara looked out the window. At the city, at the building across the street where someone had left a window box of bright red flowers that were improbably cheerful against the November sky. I think, she said slowly, that going there was the only honest thing he could offer. She paused. He's not pretending it didn't happen. He's asking me to come back to the place where it happened and sit across from him in it. Her mother made a sound that contained several things. Go, she said finally. See who he is now. Elara went on a Thursday evening in November, a year and 2 months after she'd walked out of Bellavere in the rain. She wore the dark green coat she'd bought in September because she liked it and for no other reason. She wore her hair the way she wore it when she wasn't trying to appear any particular way. She took a cab because she no longer had a car with a driver and had discovered that she preferred the ordinary city to the managed version of it. The restaurant looked the same, the gold awning, the cream lettering, the light from inside that spilled warmly onto the wet pavement because it had rained earlier and not quite stopped. She stood outside for a moment. Then she went in. He was at the corner booth, not the center of the restaurant, not somewhere conspicuous. The corner booth, which was their booth, which was where everything had begun, and where something else had ended, and where she was now standing in her dark green coat, looking at the man who had been her husband for 6 years, and who had, in the intervening year, become someone she was in the process of reconsidering. He stood when he saw her. Old habit. He'd always stood when she entered a room. There was no champagne. There was no expensive gesture waiting on the table. There was a glass of water and a glass of red wine, and the ring she had left beside his wine glass 14 months ago, placed on the white tablecloth between the two settings. She sat down. They looked at each other. Thank you for coming, he said. You asked honestly, she said. That counted for something. He nodded. He did not immediately launch into anything, no prepared speech, no careful presentation of his case. He sat across from her, and he looked at her, and he waited, which was new, which was not something Dante Moretti had historically known how to do. How is she? He said, furious about broccoli, otherwise excellent. Something shifted in his face, the almost smile of a father whose daughter has opinions. She gets that from you. The broccoli stance is from your side. He looked at her. The almost smile remained. I've missed you, he said. Quietly. Without performance, she held his gaze. I know. The wine was good. The restaurant was warm. Outside, the rain had started again, of course it had. It was November in New York, and it was always raining in the moments that mattered. She reached across the table. She picked up the ring. She turned it in her fingers, the way you turn something that has a weight that doesn't fully conform to its size. She held it for a moment. Then she set it back down, gently, and slid it across the table toward him. Keep it, she said. If there's ever another beginning between us, it won't be built from the marriage we destroyed. He looked at the ring between them, then he looked at her. And she saw something in his face that she had not seen there before. In all the years she had known him, not certainty, not authority, not the controlled projection of a man who has decided what the outcome of a situation will be. Just the open, undefended expression of a man who has accepted that he does not get to decide this. Okay, he said. She picked up her wine. Tell me about the restructuring, she said. And he did. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the marriage, Not about the night at the waterfront, not about Serena or Victor, or the year of careful distance. They talked about the businesses, about the legitimate structure she had built, and that had survived, and that he was expanding in directions that were, she had to admit, intelligent. About Mira's developmental milestones and her apparent conviction that walking was interesting, but crawling was more efficient. About small things and medium things, and the ordinary ongoing business of two people who share the most important thing in the world and are trying to figure out what that means for everything else. When the dinner was over, they walked out together. He held the door. She walked through it. On the pavement outside Bellevere, in the November rain, she turned up the collar of her dark green coat and looked at the street. "Elara," he said. She turned. He was standing in the light from the restaurant window, his coat on, no expression she could name, just his face as it actually was. Not the face he showed the world, not the managed version, just Dante in the rain, looking at her the way he had at the waterfront when he'd covered her hands with his. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She looked at him for a moment, long enough to see the person he was working to become, and to hold that against the person she remembered, and to understand that those two things were genuinely different, and that the difference mattered enough to stand in the rain for another moment before she decided what to do with it. She turned up her collar. She looked at him. "Same time next week," she said. "Somewhere without history. You pick." He held her gaze for a second. Then he nodded. She walked toward the street to flag a cab. He stood where he was, in the light from the restaurant window, and she did not look back. Not because she was certain, and not because she was performing certainty, but because some movements need to be completed in the direction you've chosen, and she had chosen the direction. And the cab was pulling up at the curb, and Vera was at home with her mother waiting, and that was enough for one November evening. The cab pulled into traffic. The city closed around her. She pressed her hand once, briefly, to her chest, not dramatically. Just the private gesture of a woman checking that the things inside her were still intact. And then she took it away and watched the lights of New York move past the window and let the evening settle into something she could carry. That was November. By December, Serena Vale had entered a formal cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors that her attorney described publicly as comprehensive, and that everyone with knowledge of the situation understood to mean she had given them everything she had in exchange for terms that reduced a potential 40-year sentence to something considerably shorter. The agreement required her to testify against Victor Calder's network in proceedings that were expected to run through the following spring, and to provide documentation supporting 17 separate charges across 3 jurisdictions. Elara read the news coverage of Serena's arrest processing on her laptop at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, while Mira sat in her high chair and dismantled a piece of toast with the focused destruction of someone who was not interested in eating so much as in understanding the structural properties of bread. She read the article twice. She looked at the photographed Serena in a coat that was somehow still unwrinkled, her face composed in the specific way it was always composed. The expression of a woman who had decided that whatever was coming next, she would meet it with her architecture intact. Elara felt something looking at that photograph. Not satisfaction exactly. Not pity either. Something more complicated and less nameable, the feeling of looking at someone whose capabilities you respected, even as you understood clearly what those capabilities had been used for. She closed the laptop. She looked at Mira. Mira looked back at her with Dante's eyes and held up a piece of toast in the manner of someone presenting evidence. "I see it," Elara said. Mira ate the toast. The sentencing hearing happened in February. Elara attended. Not because she was required to. She was not locket to the criminal proceedings, though her financial analysis had been entered as foundational evidence by the prosecutors. She attended because she had spent 14 months building toward this, and because she was the kind of person who needed to see the thing through to its actual end rather than reading about it later and wondering. She sat in the gallery, not at the front, somewhere in the middle, where she could see clearly without being particularly visible. She wore the dark green coat because it was February and cold and she liked it, not because she was making any statement about anything. Serena was brought in at 10:15. She looked across the courtroom the way she always looked. The composure was structural. It would survive things that would crack most people, and Elara had accepted that about her in the way you accept fundamental truths about a situation not with approval, just with the clear acknowledgement of what something is. The proceedings were formal and methodical and took the better part of 3 hours. Elara sat through them with her hands folded in her lap and her attention complete, because she had always that you started something, you owed it the full attention of its ending. The judge was a woman in her 60s who delivered her rulings in the flat, precise language of someone who has been living in the grammar of consequence for decades. Conspiracy, kidnapping, financial fraud across multiple jurisdictions, facilitation of arson, cooperation credit applied, sentence rendered, 11 years. The number sat in the air of the courtroom for a moment. Elara did not feel triumph. She had anticipated this and had thought about how she would feel about it, and the answer, it turned out, was something quiet and complete, the sensation of a chapter ending that had been too long and too damaging, and that was now, in the formal and irreversible way of legal proceedings, done. Serena was let out. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at Elara. She walked with her chin level and her eyes forward, and she went through the door, and the door closed, and that was the end of Serena Vale as an active element of any of their lives. Elara sat for a moment after the room had begun to clear. Then she stood, buttoned her coat, and walked out. Gale was on the courthouse steps. She hadn't known he would be there. She stopped when she saw him large, still in his dark coat, standing at the bottom of the steps with his hands in his pockets, and the expression of a man who has come somewhere because he felt it was right and is not going to over-explain the impulse. "Gale," she said, "Mrs. Moretti." He paused. Then quietly, "It's done." "Yes." He nodded once. Then he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his words from a limited and expensive supply, "You did something that most people in your situation wouldn't have done. You could have let it burn. All of it. The businesses, the organization, everything. You had reason to." She looked at him. "I wasn't saving the organization," she said. "I was saving the structure that was supposed to give Mira's father the option to be something different." Gale looked at her for a long time. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I know that now." She went down the steps. She did not take a cab back. She walked. It was February and cold, and the city was doing the specific February thing. It did gray, persistent, the trees still bare and the pavement still holding the cold of the night before. And she walked through it with her coat buttoned and her hands in her pockets, and the particular private satisfaction of a woman who has been through something that tried to erase her, and is still here, still walking, still moving forward through the ordinary, indifferent air of a Thursday morning. She called her mother from the corner of Mercer and Prince. "It's done," she said. Her mother said nothing for a moment. Then, "Come for dinner Sunday. I'm making the lamb." "Okay. Bring the baby, obviously." And Elara, a pause, the specific pause of a woman arriving at the thing she actually called to say. "I'm proud of you." Elara stood on the corner with the phone at her ear and the February wind on her face and felt those words land somewhere specific and stay there. "I know, Mom," she said. "I know." She walked home. The months that followed had the texture of a life being rebuilt not dramatically, not in any way that would make a single visible moment, but in the accumulated daily way that real changes happen. The work expanded. By March, she had 3 consulting clients, and a 4th pending, all of them drawn by the reputation that had attached itself, after the federal proceedings, to the name of the woman whose financial analysis had been central to dismantling a network that had cost the city a significant amount of money and several years of investigative resources. She had not sought the reputation. It had come because the work was good, and that was the way she preferred it. She moved in April, slightly larger apartment, still hers alone, in a building with a doorman she liked, and a view from the kitchen window that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the kitchen feel like a good place to be. She painted Mira's room herself over a long weekend with her mother's help. the two of them on ladders with rollers, and an argument about whether the particular yellow they had chosen was warm enough. And by the time they finished, the room was exactly the color Elara had wanted, and her mother had decided she had wanted it too. Dante came twice a week. He was consistent about it in a way that she hadn't entirely expected, which was its own kind of information. She had expected him to be consistent in the way that people are consistent when they are being watched or evaluated carefully, performatively. She'd expected the effort to show. Instead, the consistency was quiet. He was present with Mira in the total and genuine way of a man who had understood something important about what it meant to be present, and he left when the time was up. He did not push. He did not find reasons to stay longer. He did not ask questions about her life that were really attempts to understand whether there was space opening for him. He talked about Mira, and he listened when Elara talked about Mira, and when their conversation strayed into other territory, the business, the ongoing proceedings, the small ordinary updates of two people sharing a child, he kept them easy and without pressure. It was, Elara thought sometimes, the most mature she had ever seen him be, which was not a small thing, given that he was 39 years old and had spent those years in an environment that rewarded the opposite. On Mira's first birthday in June, Elara organized a small gathering. Her mother, Cecile, two friends from her consulting work, who had somehow become actual friends, in the way that working relationships sometimes do when the people involved are genuinely compatible. Gail, who came with a gift that was excessively large for a 1-year-old, and who sat in the corner with his enormous hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and watched the room with the expression of someone who finds it satisfying when things turn out to not have been ruined. Dante came. He sat on the living room floor with Mira and a paper plate full of the very small amount of birthday cake she was allowed to have. And Mira put her entire hand into the cake, and then looked at her hand with an expression of profound scientific interest. And Dante laughed, a real laugh, unmanaged. The laugh of a man who has found something genuinely funny in a room full of people he is not performing for, and the sound of it moved through the room in a way that Elara registered from across it. Her mother was watching her register it. Elara looked away. Her mother said nothing, which was its own form of eloquence. After the guests left, Dante helped clean up. He did not ask if he should. He simply began, moving through the kitchen with the slightly uncertain efficiency of a man who had spent most of his adult life with staff who did these things and was now learning to do them himself, which meant he was methodical but not fast. Elara washed the cake pan. He dried it. They worked in the kitchen with Mira asleep in the next room and the residue of a birthday party around them, and the particular comfortable silence of two people who have known each other long enough that silence doesn't require management. She's one, he said. Yes. A year. Roughly. He put the pan away in the wrong cabinet. She didn't correct it. She'd find it later. Elara. He set the dish towel down on the counter. Turned to look at her. I know I don't get to ask where we are. I know that's your decision to make, and I've been trying to respect that. She dried her hands, looked at him. You have, she said. But I want you to know he stopped. The thing he did sometimes, that she had observed all year in the quiet spaces of handoffs and exchanges, the moment where the controlled version reached for language and found it insufficient and had to try something more direct. I'm not doing any of this to earn something back. I want you to know that. I'm not keeping count. I'm not, he exhaled. I'm doing it because it's right, because she deserves it. Because you deserved it always, and he stopped again. Dante, she said quietly. Yeah, I know. He looked at her. I know, she said again. I can see it. That's why it's different now. She paused. That's why we're standing in a kitchen at 9 o'clock on my daughter's birthday, and I'm not asking you to leave. He held her gaze. What does that mean? He said, carefully. The wariness of a man who has learned, at significant cost, not to assume. It means I see the difference, she said, between who you were being and who you're working to be. She set the towel down. It doesn't mean everything is resolved. There's a lot between us that has to be said out loud and isn't. There's damage that doesn't disappear because one person decides to do better. She looked at him directly, with the clear, level honesty that was the most consistent thing about her. But it means I'm not closed. And I need you to understand that isn't something I give lightly, or because I'm tired of being angry, because I'm not particularly angry anymore. It's because I see you trying, and I've decided that matters. He was very still. Okay, he said, that's not a yes to anything. I know, it's just not a no anymore. He nodded. Something in his face settled in a way that was not relief, exactly, and not hope, exactly, but a version of both that had been filtered through a year of sitting with the possibility of neither. Neither. That's enough, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she handed him the dish towel. There's still a baking sheet. He took it. They finished the dishes. He left at 9:30. At the door, he paused with his coat on. Same time Thursday, he said. Same time Thursday, she agreed. He went down the hall. She closed the door. She stood in the quiet apartment, with the sounds of the city coming through the window, and her daughter sleeping in the yellow room, and the dish towel still folded neatly on the counter. And she let herself feel, for a full minute without interruption, the thing she had been carrying all evening. Not certainty, not the clear forward momentum of someone who has decided and is moving. Just the soft, specific warmth of someone who has kept a door slightly open, that they had been prepared to close permanently, and who has found that the air coming through it is, against all reasonable expectation, clean. Summer came. The consulting work grew into something she formalized, with an actual business structure, which required conversations with an accountant and an attorney, and the particular satisfaction of setting something up properly from the beginning. The business was hers alone. She did not accept investment from Dante or from anyone connected to him. She had built the structure. It would carry her name and operate under her terms and generate income that belonged entirely to her, which was not about defiance. It was about the basic requirement of a woman who had learned, at significant cost, that the ability to walk through a door alone was not just a comfort, but a necessity. She hired a part-time assistant by September, a young woman named Daria, who had a finance degree and a terrifyingly organized approach to scheduling, and who, in the first week, reorganized Elara's filing system in a way that was objectively superior, and that Elara acknowledged immediately, because she was not the kind of person who let ego interfere with recognizing good work. In October, Dante called instead of texting. He did this sometimes now, the calls that were not about logistics, that were just the ordinary connection of two people who were navigating something that didn't have a clear name. She answered. The warehouse, he said. The South Brooklyn one. Reconstruction permit came through. Ground breaks next month. She sat back in her office chair. You're doing it. I'm doing it. A pause. I put it in her name. Mira Elara Moretti Property Trust. Another pause. The attorney said the middle name was a choice. Elara pressed her lips together briefly. The attorney is correct. It's her mother's name, he said. Quietly. I wanted it there. She looked out the office window at the October street below. At the ordinary Thursday afternoon machinery of New York people and traffic, and a woman walking a very large dog with the determined indifference of someone who has accepted that the dog is in charge. Thank you, she said. She meant it fully and without complication. Don't thank me, he said. It was your idea. I know. I'm thanking you for doing it. A pause. Are you free Sunday? He asked. Mira and I are going to the park. You could stopped himself. Then, with the specific care of a man who has learned to phrase things as offers rather than assumptions. If you wanted to come, it would be good. She considered it. What time? She said. She heard something in the silence that followed that she recognized as the sound of a man not wanting to respond too fast and therefore waiting exactly one beat too long. 11, he said. We'll be there, she said. She ended the call. She turned back to her desk. She picked up the financial report she had been reviewing before he called and found her place and continued working. And the afternoon went on around her in the ordinary way of afternoons, full of the small and functional details of a life proceeding. Sunday was clear in the way October Sundays in New York sometimes are cold enough for coats, bright enough that the light on the leaves of the park trees was specific and beautiful, and the kind of thing that you look at and think, briefly, that the world is periodically capable of getting things exactly right. She got to the park at 11. Dante was already there, standing near the entrance, with Mira in his arms. Mira in a red coat that was slightly too large for her, because she was currently in a phase of growing faster than anyone's purchasing could keep up with. She was looking at a pigeon on the path with the same intense scientific interest he had directed at the birthday cake. He saw Elara coming, and his face did the thing it had been doing more often lately, the unguarded version. The one that was just his actual face responding to her presence without the management layer in between. He didn't smile extravagantly, just the slight shift of a man whose expression adjusts when the person he's looking for arrives. Myra turned her head, saw her mother, reached both arms out in the universal language of a 14-month-old who has decided that the current carrier is fine, but the preferred carrier has arrived. "I see how it is," Dante said. Elara took her. Mira grabbed a fistful of her coat collar immediately. Elara pressed her face briefly to the top of her daughter's head, the smell of her, specific and warm, and the most grounding thing she knew, and then straightened. The three of them walked into the park. It was not a reconciliation. She needed to be clear about that, at least internally, because the version of Elara Vaughn who had learned things the hard way understood the difference between a direction and a destination. This was a direction, a deliberate chosen movement towards something that was still being determined by both of them, one Sunday morning at a time. Dante walked beside her, not in front, not directing the path. Beside her, at the pace she set. Mira pointed at a squirrel with the emphatic urgencies of someone who felt strongly that this information needed to be shared. "I see it," Dante said. Mira made a sound of approval and pointed again in case he hadn't fully appreciated the squirrel. "Still there," he confirmed. Elara watched him with their daughter and felt the specific, complex experience of loving someone that you are not done being hurt by and have not finished deciding about, and understanding that both of those things can be true simultaneously, without one of them canceling the other. She had spent 14 months being clear-eyed about damage, about what it looks like when the person who was supposed to protect you does the opposite, about the way betrayal reshapes the interior architecture of a person, not just the grief of it, but the structural alteration, the way the load-bearing walls of your trust shift under the weight and take a long time to settle back into something you can build on. She had not rushed the settling. She had not let sentiment or loneliness or the logistical convenience, the contingent of a shared history shortcut the process. She had made him follow the structure she'd set, and he had followed it, and the following had told her more about who he was now than any apology could have. That was the thing about sustained behavior. It was harder to fake than a single moment. They walked to the pond. Mira was interested in the ducks. She expressed this interest with the full force of her personality, which was already, at 14 months, considerable. A duck on the near bank considered her with the impassive dignity of a creature that has observed enthusiastic toddlers before, and found them neither threatening nor particularly interesting. Dante crouched beside Mira so they were at the same level, and he said something quietly. Elara couldn't hear it from where she stood 2 steps back, and Mira turned to look at him, and then back at the duck with an expression that suggested she was incorporating his information into her ongoing assessment. Elara stood and watched her daughter, and her daughter's father crouched at the edge of the pond in the cold October light, and she made a decision. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just the quiet internal arrival at a position that had been approaching for months. She would keep the door open, not all the way, not yet, but open, genuinely open, in the honest and clear-eyed way that was the only way she knew how to do anything. There would be the conversations they still needed, to have the ones she had deferred from the hospital room, the ones that lived in the space between what happened and what it meant for what comes next. Those couldn't be avoided indefinitely, and she didn't intend to avoid them. She intended to have them when she was ready, on the terms she set, in the way that was true to who she had become in the year of building her own life, back from the materials she'd salvaged. But the door was open, and Dante, who had learned at a price she could measure, and that he would spend a long time accounting for, that the door was not his to open or close, had simply continued to stand near it, quietly, not demanding that it be opened further, not threatening to leave if it wasn't. That, she had decided, was the evidence she needed. Mira had gotten herself into a squat and was now very close to the duck, which remained philosophically unmoved. Dante had his hand near her back without touching her, the vigilant proximity of a father who has calculated the precise distance at which he can prevent a duck-related incident without impeding scientific inquiry. "She's going to touch it," Elara said. "Probably. That duck is not interested in being touched. She'll learn something either way." Elara looked at him. He looked back at her. And in the exchange was the ordinary shared humor of two people who know each other's way of seeing and recognize it when it appears, which is not a small thing, which is actually one of the larger things there is. Because that specific recognition, the moment when someone's perspective and your own land in the same place at the same time, is not something you find easily, and not something you discard without understanding what you're letting go. Myra touched the duck. The duck expressed its opinion and departed toward the center of the pond with the offended dignity of someone who had expected better from the morning. Mira watched it go, looked at her hand, looked at Dante. "Yeah," he said, "that's how that went." Mira, undeterred, turned toward the next duck. Elara laughed. Not a performance, not the polite, managed kind. The actual laugh, the one that came from the place in her chest, where real things lived, the unguarded, specific laugh of a woman watching her daughter fail to take no for an answer from a duck, and finding it, in the particular context of everything that had led to this pond on this October morning, exactly as funny as it was. Dante looked at her when she laughed. He didn't say anything. He just looked, the way you look at something that you have been afraid you wouldn't get to see again, and that you therefore do not take for granted. She caught him looking. She didn't look away. They stood by the pond in the October light, with their daughter determinedly pursuing diplomatic relations with the local waterfowl. And the city continued on the other side of the park's tree line, and the cold air moved through the space between them in the ordinary way of cold air that doesn't know it's in the middle of something. It was not a happy ending, in the way that endings sometimes present themselves clean, closed, the satisfying click of a mechanism completing its cycle. It was something more true than that, which meant it was also more complicated and less certain, and more dependent on what both of them continued to choose going forward. But Elara had stopped requiring certainty as a condition of moving. She had learned, in the past 14 months, that certainty was a thing you claimed retroactively, looking back at choices you'd made without it. You made the choices first. The certainty was just the story you told afterward about why they were right. She had chosen to stay present to her own life, with all its damage and its complicated and love, and its 14-month-old daughter, who was currently explaining her duck philosophy to Dante with emphatic gestures that he was receiving with complete seriousness. She had chosen to leave space for the man he was working to become. She had chosen not to let what was broken be the last word on what was possible. Those were her choices. She would live them one ordinary morning at a time, with the clear eyes of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and why, and who had learned, at considerable cost, that the most important person in any room she entered was herself. Mira looked back at her, reached one hand out toward her mother. Elara went to her, picked her up, held her against her chest, with the complete and total grip of a woman who has something worth holding and knows it. Dante stood beside her. The duck from the center of the pond watched all three of them with the impassive, unimpressed equanimity of a creature that had seen everything and intended to be moved by none of it. Elara looked at the water, at the light on it, at the reflection of the trees in their October color, broken and remade by every small movement of the surface. She breathed in the cold air, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel the need to be anywhere other than exactly where she was.